Most people think the biggest danger on a hike is getting lost. In these cases, the real danger was the decisions people made long before anything went wrong. Join me as I uncover some of the most avoidable hiking deaths ever recorded, from 3 influencers who turned a mountain into a photo shoot until darkness trapped them on Half Dome, to a confident young athlete who underestimated the brutal heat of Death Valley and paid the ultimate price.
This happened back in September 12th of 2017, up on Half Dome in Yosemite National Park, and it involved 3 wealthy lifestyle influencers from Los Angeles who flew in for what they thought was going to be a luxury adventure content trip. They had followings built on fashion, travel, and wellness, and they came to Yosemite with one goal in mind: get the perfect sunset photo from the top of Half Dome. That was it. That was the whole plan.
Before I get into who these women were, I think it helps to understand exactly what Half Dome actually is.
A lot of people who have never been to Yosemite picture it as just another scenic walk. Well, it's not that. Half Dome rises about 8,000 to 800 feet above sea level, and the hike to the top and back covers somewhere between 14 and 16 miles, depending on which trailhead you start from. The last 400 feet of that climb is the part everyone talks about, the cable section, where 2 steel cables run straight up a slab of smooth granite at an angle steep enough that you are essentially pulling your own body weight up using your arms and shoulders. Wooden boards are bolted in at intervals so people can pause and catch their breath, but there is nothing soft about that climb. The rangers who worked that day later admitted that they got a bad feeling almost the second these 3 showed up at the trailhead. Not because they looked unfit or unprepared in an obvious way, but because nothing about their approach matched what Half Dome actually demands.
And look, here's the thing that bothers me about a 400-foot wall of granite with steel cables bolted into it. It doesn't care who you are or how many followers you have.
It treats a movie star and a first-time tourist exactly the same way. That should have been obvious to anyone planning a trip there, and somehow it was not obvious to 3 people who built entire careers on planning trips.
I've looked into a handful of other Half Dome cable incidents while researching this episode,
and one detail comes up again and again in the official guidance the park puts out every single season. Rangers specifically tell visitors not to attempt the cables if there is any chance they will still be up there after the sun goes down, because the route has no lighting, no rescue access in the dark, and almost no margin for a single misstep. That warning is printed on signs at the trailhead, repeated by rangers stationed along the route, and posted on the park's own website months before anyone even books a flight. None of that information is hidden or hard to find. These 3 simply never went looking for it. Kaya Park, 26, was a luxury travel influencer known for prioritizing visually impressive content over practical planning. Coming from a wealthy background, she had a reputation for taking risks to get unique photos. She had spent months planning a specific Half Dome sunset photo, studying other summit images, and carefully preparing her outfit and lighting for the shot.
That detail about studying other people's photos for 6 months tells you that she spent more time planning the aesthetics of this shot than she spent actually learning anything about the mountain itself.
6 months of Pinterest boards and 0 minutes reading a single Park Service safety bulletin. That is not a small gap in preparation. That is the entire preparation missing. It also tells you something about how Kaya approached risk in general, not just on this trip. People who knew her described a pattern where she would scout a location entirely through other people's photos, and then assume that if someone else got the shot safely, she could too, without asking what conditions that other person was hiking in, what time they started, or what gear they were carrying. Copying someone's finished photo is not the same as copying their planning, and that distinction seems to have been completely lost on her going into this trip. The second woman was 25 years old Noah Rosen. She was a fitness and wellness influencer, the type who posted constantly about discipline, endurance, and mental toughness. She had done plenty of difficult workouts and short hikes, and she genuinely believed that being physically fit could get you through almost any outdoor challenge.
The problem I found was that she had basically no experience with long alpine-style climbs, the kind where conditions change fast and the terrain doesn't care how strong your legs are.
Throughout this whole ordeal, Noah became the group's main voice of confidence whenever anyone raised a concern, and that confidence ended up being incredibly dangerous.
What gets me about Noah specifically is the mismatch between her brand and her actual skill set.
Kaya's entire brand was built around pushing through discomfort and refusing to quit. That mindset works in a controlled gym environment, but it does not necessarily apply to a mountain. She repeatedly dismissed warnings during the climb, suggesting she viewed every obstacle as something that could be overcome through determination, rather than recognizing that some risks require caution instead of persistence. The third woman was 24-year-old Catalina. She was a fashion and lifestyle influencer focused on luxury brands and curated travel photography. Out of the three of them, she had the least hiking experience by far, and she leaned heavily on Kaya and Noah whenever a decision needed to be made outdoors.
From what I understand, she agreed to the Half Dome climb mostly because the summit shot just fit the visual style she wanted for her page. She wasn't someone who wanted to be there for the challenge, she wanted to be there for the content. Of the three women, Catalina is the one I keep thinking about differently than the other two.
She was not the one pushing for the climb, and she was not the one arguing with rangers. She just trusted that the other two had this handled because they sounded so sure of themselves all day.
I think that's the most relatable mistake in this entire story.
Most of us have been the third person in a group, the one who goes along because everyone else seems confident, and most of the time that works out fine. This time it did not, and that gap between most of the time and this time is exactly what makes outdoor accidents so brutal. Catalina had the least outdoor experience in the group, leaving her with no real basis to judge whether the other's confidence was informed or reckless. Unlike Kaya and Noah, she couldn't distinguish between genuine expertise and misplaced assurance driven by social media goals. By the time she might have realized the difference, it was already too late. They arrived at the trailhead much later than recommended. Rangers notice immediately that their schedule makes little sense, because most people attempting Half Dome start before sunrise. These three did not start until late morning. A ranger at the base told them directly that they were starting dangerously late, that they should expect to be descending long before sunset, and that Half Dome simply was not a sunset destination for hikers without serious experience. The women laughed and explained that they were used to extreme travel. One ranger later recalled that this was the exact moment he realized these three did not understand where they actually were. A late morning start on a 14-mile round trip is not a small scheduling error. It is close to giving away half the daylight before you have taken a single step.
And the laugh is the part I can't get past. You can forgive someone for not knowing the mileage or the elevation gain off the top of their head.
It is much harder to forgive someone for being told directly by a trained ranger that their plan is dangerous and responding with a laugh instead of a single follow-up question.
I think about what a single follow-up question would have actually cost them at that moment.
Something as simple as asking how many hours the round trip typically takes, or whether other hikers ever attempt a sunset summit and what happens to them on the way down. That question takes 10 seconds to ask and could have completely changed the rest of the day. Instead, they treated a direct safety warning from a uniformed professional the same way they might treat an unsolicited comment from a stranger online, something to brush past rather than something to actually weigh. When the rangers later went through what these women actually packed, it painted a pretty clear picture of where their priorities were. They brought multiple outfit changes, several pounds of camera gear, tripods, cosmetic bags, portable lighting equipment, and battery packs for all of it. What they left behind was almost unbelievable. No headlamps, not enough water for a hike of that length, no emergency layers for when the temperature drops at elevation once the sun goes down, no backup batteries for actual navigation equipment, just for their cameras and lights. They apparently assumed their smartphone flashlights would be enough to get them down a vertical granite face in total darkness if it came to that. A headlamp costs about $20 and weighs next to nothing. An extra liter of water adds maybe 2 pounds to a pack that already had several pounds of camera equipment stuffed into it. So this was not a weight problem, and it was not a cost problem. This was three women deciding, without ever saying it out loud, that the equipment for capturing the moment mattered more than the equipment for surviving it. That is the single packing list detail that tells you everything about how this day was framed before it even started.
I went back and forth on whether to call this an oversight or a decision, because oversight makes it sound accidental, like nobody thought about it.
But three separate people packed three separate bags for this trip, and not one of them flagged a headlamp as worth bringing, while all three somehow agreed that portable lighting rigs for video were essential. That is not an accident. That tells you what each of them, independently, considered a priority for this day, and survival gear simply did not make the list. The hike becomes a content production day instead of a climb. Every major viewpoint becomes a photo shoot, an outfit change, video shoots for social media, multiple retakes. At Vernal Fall, they stopped for 45 minutes. At Nevada Fall, nearly an hour. At Little Yosemite Valley, another extended break for sponsored content. By mid-afternoon, they were already behind schedule. Add that up with me for a second. 45 minutes, then close to 60, then another extended stop on top of that. That is somewhere around 2.5 hours burned on photography alone before they even reach the halfway point of the climb, and none of that includes the actual walking time. A normal round trip for an early starting, steady hiker takes somewhere between 10 and 12 hours total. These three spent almost a quarter of that entire budget on tripod angles before they had gone half the distance. And the part that should scare you is that the hardest section, the cables, was still completely ahead of them.
What really gets me is that none of these 3 stops happened at locations where stopping made any logical sense from a safety standpoint.
Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall are beautiful, sure, but they are also exactly the kind of spot where a long pause eats directly into the cushion you need for the summit attempt later. A smart group plans its long stops near the beginning of a trip when there is daylight to spare and keeps things moving once the harder terrain starts. This group did the opposite without seeming to notice, treating every waterfall like it existed in its own bubble with no connection to the hours ticking away on the rest of the route. A backcountry ranger encounters them near Subdome. He notices their pace, their equipment, and the amount of remaining daylight. He strongly recommends turning around immediately, skipping the summit, and returning another day. He explains that sunset photography is not worth descending the cables in darkness. Kaya insists they only need a few pictures. The ranger is unconvinced. A few pictures is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it is worth sitting with for a second. A few pictures implies a quick stop, in and out, nothing that should cost real time. But we already know from Vernal Fall and Nevada Fall that a few pictures for this group meant 45 minutes minimum. Kaya was not lying to the ranger exactly. She was lying to herself about what a few pictures had actually been costing them all day. And that self-deception is a much harder thing to argue someone out of than a simple misunderstanding.
I find it interesting that the ranger near Subdome didn't just repeat the generic safety message every hiker gets at the trailhead.
He looked specifically at their pace and their gear before forming his recommendation, which tells me he was reading the situation in real time rather than just reciting a script. That is a more informed warning than the first one they received, built on actual evidence of how the day had gone so far, and it still did not land any harder than the first warning had. The climb is taking much longer than expected, and signs of trouble emerge. Catalina is exhausted, water supplies are running low, Noah develops leg cramps. Several hikers descending warn them they are cutting it too close. They dismiss every concern. Noah repeatedly says they are almost there, despite the fact that they still have the hardest section ahead. I want to single out the leg cramps specifically, because that is not a vague feeling of being tired. That is your body sending a very concrete signal that it is running low on water and electrolytes. Cramps at altitude on a long climb are the kind of thing a hiking guide would treat as a hard stop, not a minor inconvenience to push through. Noah, the fitness influencer, whose whole brand was built around understanding her own body, either did not recognize what cramping actually meant, or recognized it and decided the summit mattered more anyway. Neither option reflects well on someone whose entire platform is built on physical expertise. And it was not only their own bodies sending warning signs. Hikers who had already summited and were heading back down took the time to stop and tell them directly that they were cutting things too close, which means strangers, with no reason to lie and nothing to gain, were independently reaching the same conclusion as the rangers. When your own cramping legs, your dwindling water supply, and total strangers coming down the mountain are all telling you the same thing at the same time, that is not a single data point you can dismiss. That is 3 unrelated sources of information all converging, and converging warnings like that almost never turn out to be wrong. Noah's repeated line that they were almost there is also worth examining on its own, because almost there can mean wildly different things depending on what is actually left to cover. From where they were standing, the remaining distance was short in terms of feet, but the remaining difficulty was the steepest, most exposed section of the entire route. Measuring how close you are by distance instead of by difficulty is exactly the kind of error that turns a hard day into a fatal one, and it is an error a more experienced alpine hiker would never have made. At the cable section, they stop repeatedly, take photos while climbing, film social media videos, and hold poses while other hikers wait. Several hikers become irritated. One warns them that this is not the place to be messing around. The women continue, and their summit arrival is delayed even further. The cables only fit one direction of traffic comfortably at a time, which means every pose they held was not just slowing themselves down, it was forcing strangers behind them to dangle on a steel cable bolted into granite while waiting for an outfit check. That is the moment in the story where this stops being purely about their own risk tolerance and starts putting other people in an uncomfortable, exposed position against their will.
I don't think the women were trying to be reckless towards strangers. I think that they had simply stopped noticing that other people existed on the route at all.
There is a specific kind of tunnel vision that comes from being on camera, where the people standing just outside the frame stop registering as real obstacles to consider. I imagine that is exactly what happened here. Every pause for a photo probably felt, in the moment, like it was costing 30 seconds, when in reality, each one was forcing a line of strangers to stand still on an exposed cable route with nothing but a steel wire between them and a very long fall. The frustrated hiker who finally spoke up was not being rude. He was pointing out something that should have been obvious from the very first pose. Near the summit, a ranger descending gives what becomes the final warning. He explains that they need to leave almost immediately, that darkness comes quickly, the granite becomes difficult to navigate, and temperatures are dropping. He tells them plainly that staying for sunset is going to create a serious problem getting down. They assure him they will leave soon. 3 rangers, 3 separate locations along the route, 3 independent warnings, all saying some version of the same thing without ever coordinating with each other. That consistency is the part I keep coming back to. When 3 different professionals who have never spoken to each other that day all reach the identical conclusion within a span of a few hours, that is not caution, that is a pattern being read correctly by everyone except the 3 people it actually applied to. I think it is also worth noticing how the tone of these warnings escalated as the day went on. The first ranger at the trailhead was informative, almost matter-of-fact. The second one near Subdome was firmer, specifically recommending they turn around. By the time the third ranger caught them near the summit, he was described as unusually direct, going out of his way to spell out exactly what kind of problem they would face. That escalation is not rangers becoming more dramatic for no reason. That is professionals adjusting their language in real time because the danger genuinely kept increasing with every hour that passed, and each one of them could see it clearly even from a single brief encounter. Once on top, the summit becomes an outdoor studio. Outfit changes continue, tripods are repositioned dozens of times, hundreds of photos are taken. Video filming consumes even more time. The sun begins dropping, other hikers leave. The summit gradually empties, the women remain.
The summit gradually empties is the detail I would put at the center of this whole episode if I had to pick just one.
Every single other person standing on that rock looked at the same fading light and made the same calculation and walked away. That is not a ranger giving advice that could be dismissed as overly cautious. That is dozens of ordinary strangers, with no authority and nothing to gain from being right, all independently voting with their feet. Watching that happen around you and still staying for more shots is choosing to ignore the clearest, least biased warning available that day. Picture the actual scene for a second. A crowded summit at golden hour, dozens of people taking in the same view, and then slowly, group by group, the crowd starts thinning out as people head for the cables while there is still usable light. By the time the sun is actually setting, the 3 of them are likely standing in a space that used to be packed and is now mostly empty, with maybe a handful of stragglers left. That kind of visual should hit differently than any verbal warning, because it requires no interpretation at all. It is just math playing out in front of your eyes. And somehow, it still was not enough. Sunset arrives. The photographs look incredible. The women celebrate. But now, the trail is almost empty, the cables are below them, and darkness is spreading across the granite. One hiker heading down urges them to follow. They stay behind for just a few more shots. That decision ultimately seals their fate. I keep replaying that phrase, just a few more shots, because by this point in the day, it had already been said in some form at least 4 separate times, at Vernal Fall, at Nevada Fall, on the cables, and now here at the summit with no daylight left to spend. It worked as an excuse every previous time because there had always been enough daylight cushion left to absorb the cost. This was the first time it was said with absolutely no cushion remaining, and nobody in the group seemed to register that the math had finally run out. This is also where I think the hiker who urged them to follow deserves more credit than he probably ever got. He had no obligation to say anything at all. He could have just kept walking down, focused on his own descent, and nobody would have blamed him for it. Instead, he stopped, specifically addressed them, and tried to get them moving while there was still a sliver of usable light left. That is one more independent voice added to a pile of warnings that already included 3 rangers and a thinning summit crowd, and it still was not enough to change their minds. By the time they reach the cables, the sun is gone. Moonlight is limited. Their phones are already losing battery. The granite surface is difficult to see. The steel cables disappear into darkness below. Several descending hikers pass using proper headlamps. The women are struggling to make out the route ahead. Panic begins to replace confidence. Granite holds heat from the sun during the day, and then cools fast once the sun sets, which means condensation can start forming on the surface right around the time these 3 were finally descending, on top of failing phone batteries and 0 headlamps between them. Every single piece of bad luck stacking up in this paragraph traces directly back to a choice made hours earlier. The condensation was always going to happen at that hour. The only variable that changed was whether a hiker was still on the cables when it did, and that variable was entirely in their control. What makes this paragraph so hard to read is that none of these individual problems would have mattered much on their own. Limited moonlight alone is manageable with a headlamp. A dying phone battery alone is manageable if it is not your only light source. Slick granite alone is manageable if you can actually see where your feet are landing. It was the combination of all four happening at once, stacked directly on top of each other, that turned a difficult descent into an impossible one. And every one of those four factors traces back to a decision that could have been made differently earlier in the day. Kaya reaches a congested section of the cables. Attempting to let another climber pass, she steps outside the designated path. Her shoe loses traction on smooth granite. Witnesses hear a scream. She disappears over the edge. Noah instinctively reaches toward her, shifts her weight forward while trying to look over the edge, and loses her grip on the cable. She falls seconds later. Catalina remains frozen on the cables for several minutes, then attempts to descend alone, slips on moisture forming on the cooling granite, and slides off a steep section below the main cable route. I am not going to dramatize this any further than I already have, because 3 people lost their lives within a span of just a few minutes, and that deserves to be treated with weight, rather than turned into a spectacle. What I will say is that almost every factor in this sequence, the darkness, the congestion, the wet granite, the panic, had been predicted out loud by rangers hours earlier in the day. Rangers launched a search operation overnight, but darkness prevented immediate recovery efforts, and search teams already feared the worst because of where the falls occurred. At first light, all 3 bodies were located below separate sections of the route, and phones containing hundreds of summit photographs were recovered. None contained images of the descent. Several rangers later stated privately that they had expected an accident long before sunset, not because the women were unlucky, but because every warning they received throughout the day had been ignored, and each bad decision pushed them closer to a situation that experienced hikers spend years learning to avoid.
The thing I keep landing on after putting this whole episode together is that nobody failed to warn them.
3 rangers tried, dozens of strangers tried just by leaving when they left, and the math of a fading sunset tried in its own quiet way the entire afternoon. The only thing missing that day was someone inside that group willing to value a warning over a photograph, even just once. It was July 10th, 2021, and the thermometer outside the visitor center at Furnace Creek had already cleared 117 degrees before lunch. Death Valley was in the middle of the kind of heat wave that makes the national news. The week the official gauge would touch 130, one of the highest temperatures ever reliably recorded anywhere on the planet. To put that in perspective, a normal oven set to keep food warm sits not far above that. The parking lot at the Golden Canyon trailhead shimmered like there was water on it. Most people who pulled in took one step out of their air conditioning, felt the air hit them like an open oven door, and got right back in their cars to go find a viewpoint they could enjoy through a windshield. The radio that morning was full of heat warnings, the kind that tell people to stay indoors, check on elderly neighbors, and never leave anyone sitting in a parked car. And the whole region was bracing for a day that would break records. One of them did not. Her name was Leanna Marchetti, 28 years old, and to thousands of people online, she was a full-time adventure influencer. Her whole brand was being the fearless one, the girl who did the thing everyone else was too scared or too sensible to do, and she had the numbers to prove that people loved watching it. She had built that following over years, one bigger risk at a time, swimming in places with signs that said "do not swim," climbing things that were roped off, walking up to wild animals other people backed away from. The trouble with a brand like that is that it has to keep escalating. An audience that follows you because you are fearless gets bored the moment you start looking careful, and Leanna knew it. Every video had to be a little bolder than the last one, a little closer to a line, and the comments rewarded her every time she leaned further out over the edge. She had come to Death Valley in the worst week of the entire summer on purpose, because heat that made the news made for views, and a video of her conquering the hottest place on Earth in record temperatures was exactly the kind of thing her audience showed up for. She had the whole video planned in her head before she ever left the car. The dramatic walk into the canyon, the harsh light, a piece to camera at the top about pushing past your limits, and a caption about doing the thing everyone swore was impossible. It was going to be one of her best, the kind of post that pulls in a wave of new followers and a flood of comments calling her a legend. In a strange way, the ranger had handed her a gift, because now the video had a villain to wave off at the start, a perfect little setup for the triumph she was certain was waiting at the end. Here's the thing you have to understand about how she saw a place like this. To Leanna, a warning was not a warning, it was a setup for a better video. The scarier something sounded, the better the story when she walked away from it, smiling, unbothered, proven right. She had spent years training her audience to expect exactly that, and she had spent those same years quietly training herself to ignore the part of her brain that was supposed to be afraid. By the time she got to Death Valley, that part of her had been overruled so many times that it had basically stopped speaking up.
I've seen her type before, the kind who built a brand on ignoring advice, so to her, a ranger saying no was just more content.
Death Valley is not dangerous the way a cliff is dangerous, where you can see the edge and respect it. It kills you quietly, through a number on a thermometer that does not look like it should be able to hurt you. There is no claw, no fall, no single dramatic moment, just heat, steady and patient and absolutely without mercy. That is exactly what makes it so deadly, because a threat you cannot see and cannot feel sneaking up on you is a threat that is very easy to underestimate right up until the point where it is far too late to do anything about it. In heat like that, your body is in a fight from the second you step outside. You sweat out water faster than you could ever drink it back, and because the desert air is so dry, the sweat evaporates off your skin almost the instant it appears, so you often cannot even see that you are drenched and emptying out. The official temperature is always measured in the shade. Out in the open, on dark rock, in direct sun, the real temperature against your body runs far higher than whatever number the sign in the parking lot shows. People walk out into that believing the sign, never understanding that the sign was describing the easiest version of where they were going. By the time most people understand that difference, they are already deep into the canyon, already low on water, and already feeling a little off in a way they cannot quite put a name to. Death Valley kills people every single year, and the ones it kills are almost always the ones who came to look at it rather than to survive it. Tourists step out for a quick photo and go down within sight of the road. Hikers underestimate a short trail and never climb back out of it. The rangers will tell you the same thing over and over, that the desert does not care how fit you are or how many hard things you have done somewhere cooler. Fitness buys you a little extra time out here and absolutely nothing more. What actually keeps you alive is respect, water, and the sense to be shaded and still when the sun is at its worst.
I tell people Death Valley in July is not a desert, it's a furnace with a parking lot.
The hike she had picked was the Golden Canyon Loop, a route that climbs up through a maze of golden and red rock toward the famous overlook at Zabriskie Point and comes back down through a wash called Gower Gulch. In the cool months, it is one of the most beautiful and popular day hikes in the entire park, busy with families and photographers. In July, it is a different thing wearing the same name. There is no water anywhere on it, none, and there is no shade either, not a single tree, not one reliable overhang, just bare rock that drinks the sun all day and throws it back at you from every direction at once. The Badlands have one more trick to them, and it is the one that turns a heat emergency into a death. They look identical in every direction. The same bleached gold walls, the same dry folds and ridges, narrow side canyons branching off the main route like hallways in a building with no signs and no numbers on the doors. With a clear head and a marked trail, it is a wonderful place to wander. With a cooking brain and no landmarks, it is a trap that closes so softly you do not even hear it shut behind you. Search teams have pulled people out of those exact side canyons before, some of them only a short distance off the main trail, close enough that on a clear-headed day they could have walked back out in minutes.
I've walked those Badlands, and there's no shade out there. Not a tree, not an overhang, just rock throwing heat back at you.
The man standing near the trailhead that morning was a ranger named Cal Renfro. Cal had worked Death Valley for the better part of 30 years, and in that time he had helped carry more than a few people out of these canyons, some of them walking and shaking and lucky, and some of them not walking at all. Summer was the season he hated, because summer was when people came from all over the world to see the famous heat, treating a killer like a tourist attraction, and a certain number of them every single year decided that the warnings were meant for somebody else. He had learned over the decades to read people fast, because reading them fast was sometimes the only thing that saved them. He knew the difference between the hiker who was nervous and prepared and the hiker who was confident and carrying nothing. He knew that the dangerous ones were almost never the ones who looked scared. They were the ones who looked sure of themselves. The ones who had clearly done risky things before and gotten away with it, because getting away with it was exactly what taught them they could not be hurt. Cal spotted Liana the moment she stepped out of her car with a phone already pointed at her own face.
Cal spent 30 years pulling people off that trail. When a man like that tells me to turn around, I'm back in my car before he even finishes the sentence.
He did what he always did. He walked over, friendly but serious, and told her plainly that she should not attempt the loop today. He told her it was already over 115 degrees and still climbing, that the canyon would be hotter still with no air moving through it, and that people had died on easier hikes than this one, in less heat than this. He pointed at the small bottle clipped to her bag and told her that was not nearly enough water, that a hike like this in this heat needed gallons, not a bottle. He told her that if she truly meant to do it, she had to start at first light the next morning, not late on a day that was already an emergency. None of what Cal said was an opinion, and none of it was him being dramatic. It was the same message printed on the big signs all around the parking lot, the ones with the red letters that exist precisely because so many people have died doing exactly what she was about to do. The park does not send rangers out to warn people at that trailhead in a heat wave for fun. It puts them there because that specific trail, in that specific heat, has a body count, and because a friendly human voice saying "turn around" saves more lives than any sign ever has. Cal had personally turned a lot of people back over the years. Most of them, when it came down to it, listened. Liana did not listen. She turned the camera on him instead. For her followers, she narrated the whole thing as it happened. This overprotective ranger who thought a little walk was going to kill her, who so clearly did not know who he was talking to. She let him finish, thanked him with the kind of smile that was really a dismissal, and told him she would be totally fine. She did stuff like this all the time. Then she clipped her one small bottle back onto her bag, fixed her hair in the camera, and started up the trail into the canyon while he stood there and watched her go. There was nothing he could legally do to stop a grown woman from taking a walk in a national park. She was not the only person Cal spoke to that morning, and she was not the only one who had shown up wanting to hike. The difference was that the others listened. A couple turned around right there in the lot and decided to come back at dawn instead. A young guy who had planned the very same loop took one more look at the heat shimmering off the rock, thanked the ranger, and went to find an air-conditioned diner. None of them got a video out of it, and all of them are still alive. That is the quiet, unglamorous truth about this place, that the people who leave with nothing to post are usually the ones who leave at all. I've watched that clip more than once. She rolls her eyes at Cal while he tells her people die out here. I have thought a lot about what was going through her head as she walked away from that man. I do not think she was being brave, and I do not even think she was being stupid in the way we usually mean it. I think she had simply done this exact thing so many times, ignored so many warnings, and walked away fine that the warnings had stopped carrying any weight at all. Cal was not a 30-year expert to her. He was just one more worried voice to wave off on the way to the shot she wanted. No different from a comment telling her to be careful that she would scroll right past. She started up Golden Canyon a little before 11 in the morning, which is just about the worst possible hour to begin. The early part of the trail was everything she had come for. The walls rose up around her in deep gold and rust red. The light was harsh and dramatic in a way that looks incredible on camera, and the footage she shot in that first half hour was really beautiful. She was moving easily, the trail rising only gently as it wound up into the canyon, narrating as she went, smiling, vindicated. There was no reason in those first minutes for her to feel anything but good about her choice, and that, more than anything, is how the desert gets you. Heading into those canyons at noon never feels dangerous in the moment, and that's the trick of it. I've watched the desert let people walk in. The trail drew her deeper in. She climbed up the side spur toward Red Cathedral, a towering wall of rust-colored rock that is one of the most photographed spots on the whole route, and then pushed on up toward Manly Beacon and the high point of the loop. Down in the lower canyon, the rock walls pressed in close on both sides and trapped the heat like an oven with the door shut. No breeze at all, not a breath of moving air to carry any of it away. Higher up, where the trail climbed out of the canyon and into the open badlands toward Manly Beacon, the walls fell away and took even the idea of shade with them, leaving her out under a sun that did not let up for a second. She was sweating hard now, though in that dryness she still could not see it, and she was reaching for her one bottle far more often than she had planned to. What made the first part feel so easy was also exactly what made it so dangerous, and she had no way to feel that yet. The trail climbs the whole way in, gaining hundreds of feet up through the wash and out into the open badlands toward the high ground around Manly Beacon, and the hardest, most exposed stretch of the loop was still ahead of her. Every comfortable step in the cool of the morning carried her deeper into the maze and farther from the only safety there was, her car back at the trailhead. She felt strong and capable and completely right. The desert was simply waiting for the heat of the afternoon to hand her the bill.
The first part of that trail feels easy, a gentle walk up a pretty canyon. I promise you that's just the desert letting you get far from your car.
By the time she reached the upper section, somewhere in the early afternoon, the temperature down in that open canyon was well past anything the visitor center sign had shown that morning. This is the part of these stories that people who have never stood in it cannot quite picture. It was not uncomfortable the way a hot day at home is uncomfortable. It was a physical force, a steady pressure leaning on her from every direction, the air itself too hot to take any heat away from her no matter how hard or fast she breathed. Her pace fell off. The filming, the entire reason she had driven out here, slowed and then mostly stopped because the heat had begun to demand everything she had just to keep putting one foot in front of the other. By the middle of the afternoon, the canyon had become something close to a kiln. The walls threw heat at her face and her back at the same time, the ground cooked up through the soles of her shoes, and the air gave her nothing to work with no matter how deeply she breathed. She had stopped filming a while ago. The bright, chatty narration of the morning was gone, replaced by the simple animal work of moving forward through air that felt like it was trying to hold her in place. She was deep into the loop now, too far along for turning back to feel obvious, and nowhere near close enough to the end for finishing to be safe. There is a cruel arithmetic to a loop trail in heat like that, where the safest choice and the fastest choice stop being the same thing, and a tired brain almost always grabs for fast. Somewhere on that upper stretch, her water ran out. The small bottle that Cal had pointed at and warned her about, the one she had clipped back on with a smile, was empty hours before she could possibly be back at her car, and there was not one more drop anywhere on that trail. From that moment, she was on a clock that could not be stopped or reset. She was losing water with every breath and every step, in temperatures that would not begin to drop until long after dark, with the hardest climbing of the loop and the long descent through Gower Gulch still standing between her and the parking lot.
She carried one little designer water bottle on a hike that needed a gallon. In that heat, that bottle is not water, it's a timer.
The first real trouble was almost certainly a headache and a creeping dizziness, the kind of thing that is easy to argue yourself out of for a little while when you are determined to finish. But in heat like that, the body does not give you long to negotiate. As she kept moving, her core temperature was climbing past the point a human being can survive, and the warning signs were stacking up one on top of another. The pounding head, the wave of nausea, the strange and sudden heaviness in her legs that no amount of willpower could lift. At some point, and this is one of the most dangerous moments of all, her skin would have stopped feeling sweaty and started feeling hot and dry. That is the signal that the body's entire cooling system has failed, that it has run out of water to sweat with and simply given up trying. From there, the internal temperature rises fast, and the organ that suffers first and worst is the brain. The very tool she needed most to save herself, clear and careful thinking, was the first thing the heat reached in and switched off.
Heat stroke doesn't feel like just being hot. Your judgment is the first thing to go, so the moment you need to think clearly, your own brain stops helping you.
And this is where the desert does its cruelest work, because once the thinking goes, everything else follows. A clear-headed person in trouble turns around and retraces their steps straight back to the trailhead they know. Liana, by every later reconstruction of what happened, did the opposite of that. Somewhere up in the maze of the upper Badlands, she left the main trail entirely, turning off into a narrow side canyon. Whether she was chasing one last shot, or convinced it was a shortcut, or simply no longer able to tell the difference. The marked loop was hard enough in that heat. Off the trail, in that terrain, she had just walked into the one place nobody searching would think to look first. Investigators believe she did try to keep going for a long while, the way determined people do, pushing through signals that should have stopped her cold. But heat does not respect determination. The very grit that had built her whole career, the refusal to quit, the certainty that she could power through anything, was now working directly against her, driving her forward and burning through her last reserves when the one thing that might have saved her was to stop, find whatever sliver of shelter existed, and wait for the cool of night. Her greatest strength had quietly turned into the thing walking her toward the edge.
Those canyons all look the same inside, like a maze cut from an oven. You don't feel lost in there until you already are.
The side canyons of the Badlands are a trap built for exactly this situation. They branch and fork and double back on themselves, every wall the same washed out gold as the last, and they swallow sound and phone signal alike. The phone she trusted for absolutely everything would have been useless to her by now. No service down in the rock, and a battery cooking past the point it would even turn on. She had no paper map, no compass, no extra water, and no clear idea anymore of which direction would take her back. She was wandering, slower and slower, through a place that offered her the same blank answer every way she turned. Time worked against her now, in a way she could not feel. Every minute she spent lost was a minute of water she did not have, in heat that was still climbing toward its afternoon peak. She had told no one her exact plan beyond the ranger she had laughed at. No friend was waiting at the bottom with a worried eye on the time. No partner was tracking her location on a phone. No one in the world who loved her knew precisely where she was or when she was supposed to be back. She had traded all of that away long ago for the freedom to do whatever she wanted, and out here that freedom had nothing left to give her. What followed was slow and disoriented, and, from the outside, almost quiet. She moved through the side canyons with no real direction. The walls all the same, the sun straight overhead and then sliding west, every turn looking like a way out and ending in more rock. She had no shade to rest in and no water to wait on. The smart move, if any move was still smart by then, was to stop and conserve. But a confused, overheating brain rarely makes the smart move, and hers was already past making much of any decision at all. Even if she had somehow been able to call for help, the rescue most people quietly assume is always waiting was not a sure thing on a day like that one. Helicopters do not fly the same in extreme heat, because the thin, superheated air gives the rotor blades far less to grab onto, and operations in the worst of the afternoon get much harder and sometimes get grounded entirely. The people who could have come for her, with no idea she was in trouble, no idea she had left the route hours ago, and no way to reach the fold of Badlands she had wandered into even if somehow they had known to try. Everybody out there is quietly counting on a helicopter. In that heat, the air gets too thin for the rotors to lift, and that's a bet I would never make. Heat stroke, once it truly takes hold, moves through the body in stages, and not one of them can be willed away by wanting it badly enough. The confusion deepens into something close to drunkenness. Coordination goes so that walking a straight line becomes impossible. As the core temperature keeps climbing, the organs begin to fail in sequence, and the overheating brain shuts down its higher functions one by one, the way a building powers down floor by floor. A person that far gone stops being able to make a plan, then stops being able to stand, and finally stops being able to do anything at all but sit down where they are. There is a moment where your legs simply stop listening. You are awake, you are scared, and your body has already decided it is finished. Eventually, her body did the deciding for her. The walking slowed to a stagger, the stagger to a few steps at a time, and then to nothing. Somewhere up that dead-end wash, she sat down in the only patch of ground she could reach, and she did not get up again. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing like the movies, just a strong young woman quietly running out of everything a person needs to stay alive in a place that had been trying to tell her exactly that since the moment she stepped out of her car. The desert did not cool off anywhere near fast enough to save her. Even after the sun finally dropped behind the ridgelines, the rock held the day's heat for hours and kept breathing it back out into the dark, and by then, the damage inside her was long past undoing. She was off any trail, a searcher would walk in the dark, tucked up a sidewash in the Badlands with a dead phone and an empty bottle, in a silence so total that most people will never experience anything like it in their lives. All those followers, all that constant noise that had filled every single day of her adult life, and there was not another person anywhere near her in that black stretch of desert. Thousands of people watched her that week, and she died with not one of them within 50 miles of her. The desert never once cared how many followers she had. Liana Marchetti died that night in a side canyon of the Golden Canyon Badlands, of hyperthermia, her body finally overwhelmed by a heat it was never built to withstand, only a handful of hours after she had smiled into her own camera and waved off the one man who tried to save her life. She had come to the hottest place on Earth to prove that she could beat it, in the worst week anyone had ever picked to try, and the desert did to her exactly what the ranger had said it would, on very nearly the timeline he had laid out. She was never going to win that fight. She had walked away from her one real chance of surviving it. The moment she walked away from him, her rental car sat alone in the Golden Canyon lot through the evening and deep into the night. She had come to the park by herself, with no one expecting her anywhere, so there was no worried phone call to start things sooner, just that one car that never left. In a heat wave like that, rangers keep an eye on the popular trailheads, and when the car was still there long after dark, the Park Service knew someone had gone in and not come out. At first light the next morning, they began to look. It still took them well into the morning to find her, off the marked loop, up a dead-end side wash she never should have entered. The Inyo County coroner ruled the cause of death as hyperthermia, heat stroke, the very thing the signs in that parking lot warn about in big red letters, the very thing Cal Renfro had stood there and told her to her face. On the phone recovered with her body, investigators found all of it: the gorgeous Golden Canyon, the bright, confident narration, and near the very beginning, the clip of a park ranger calmly trying to talk her out of the exact hike that ended up killing her. She had filmed her own warning, she had filmed herself laughing it off. And the thousands of people who had spent years cheering her on for being fearless were left to sit with what fearless had finally cost. Cal told her face to face how this would end, and she filmed it for laughs. He drove home that night safely. Meanwhile, she lost her life in one of the most brutal ways possible. It was July 12, 2013. The day began inside Golden Canyon Trail at Death Valley National Park, where extreme summer temperatures regularly transform an otherwise accessible trail into a dangerous environment for unprepared visitors. Alain Arcega was 23 years old and grew up in Fresno. Back in high school, he played wide receiver on the football team, and even after graduation, that athlete mentality never really went away.
Wide receiver. I keep picturing him running sprints in full pads, pushing through the last set when everyone else had already quit.
It just followed him into adulthood. He was living in Bakersfield, working part-time as a personal trainer, lifting weights almost every day, and running 5-kilometer races on weekends. He also had a small fitness page on Instagram where he'd post workout clips and progress updates from time to time. Staying active wasn't just a hobby for Alain anymore. It had become a huge part of who he was. And that's actually important, because it shaped the way he dealt with physical challenges. Alain was the kind of person who was used to pushing through discomfort. If something was hard, his first instinct usually wasn't to slow down or stop. It was to keep going and trust that his body could handle it. Over time, that mindset had become normal for him. But it also meant his threshold for turning around, asking for help, or admitting that something was becoming dangerous was a little higher than it might have been for other people, and that's not unusual at all. You see it a lot with athletes and people whose identities are built around being strong, capable, and physically dependable. The problem is that some environments don't reward that mindset. In places like a gym, a football field, or a weekend race, pushing through discomfort can actually work in your favor. But in a place like Death Valley, where the environment itself can overwhelm the human body, ignoring those early warning signs can become incredibly dangerous. Alain had no documented medical conditions, no history of heat illness, and toxicology later returned negative for all substances. He was, by every clinical measure, a healthy young man.
Part always stops me. Completely healthy. Nothing working against him on paper.
However, being physically fit can sometimes create false confidence in unfamiliar environments, because adaptation to one type of physical stress does not automatically translate to another. He was accompanied by Troyjan Delgado, 25, a warehouse supervisor, and Neftar Yi, 24, a part-time community college student, both from Bakersfield. None of the three had meaningful experience in desert environments. Although they had grown up in California's Central Valley, where temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, the heat of the Central Valley and the heat of Death Valley are fundamentally different, a distinction that is often underestimated by first-time visitors. The Death Valley trip had been discussed casually for months as a bucket list idea. Its reputation as one of the hottest places on Earth was part of its appeal rather than a deterrent. For three men in their 20s who had never seriously considered what that reputation actually meant, the extremity itself made the destination attractive. Eventually, they settled on the weekend of July 12th without giving much thought to the timing. What they didn't realize was that they had chosen one of the hottest weekends of the year to visit Death Valley. July is brutal there. Temperatures regularly climb somewhere between 115 and 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's the time of year when park rangers deal with some of their highest numbers of heat-related emergencies. And that's actually something the park tries very hard to communicate. Death Valley's extreme temperatures aren't advertised as some exciting attraction, they're presented as a warning. The park wants visitors to understand exactly what kind of environment they're stepping into, but none of the three had really looked into any of that beforehand. Originally, the plan was actually pretty simple. Troyjan and Neftar had suggested keeping it easy. They would drive out to Badwater Basin, take a few pictures at the marker that identifies it as the lowest point in North America, spend a few minutes looking around, and then head back to the air-conditioned car.
I thought that was a good plan. A genuinely good plan.
That was it. It wasn't supposed to be a hiking trip at all. It was really just meant to be a short sightseeing stop before heading home. Alain changed that plan during the drive. After finding the Golden Canyon Trail on his phone, he proposed adding a hike and pushed for it with enough confidence that the simpler alternative began to feel overly cautious. He had no prior desert hiking experience, but he assumed his athletic background and overall fitness would make the environment less challenging for him. That assumption is common and often harmless in ordinary settings. In Death Valley in July, it can be fatal. Golden Canyon Trail is a relatively short 3-mile round-trip route near Furnace Creek that leads through narrow passageways and colorful sedimentary formations toward Red Cathedral, the usual turnaround point. It is a popular trail because it requires no technical skills, specialized equipment, or difficult climbing. But that's also part of what makes Golden Canyon dangerous. To first-time visitors, it doesn't look intimidating at all. It looks like an easy walk you could do in regular workout clothes and running shoes. The problem is that the environment is far more dangerous than it appears. Experienced desert hikers understand that. Most first-time visitors don't. And during July, the canyon actually makes the heat even worse. The rock walls absorb sunlight and radiate that heat back into the narrow passageways, while the ground itself can exceed 160 degrees Fahrenheit when air temperatures approach 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So hikers aren't just dealing with the temperature shown on a weather report. They're being hit by heat from above, below, and all around them at the same time.
And what feels deceptive to me is how harmless it looks from the outside, like an easy shaded walk, until you're already inside it and realize how quickly the conditions change.
Conditions on that day further removed many of the body's natural sources of relief. Relative humidity was extremely low, causing sweat to evaporate almost immediately and making it difficult to recognize how quickly fluid was being lost. Winds were minimal, providing virtually no cooling effect. Death Valley can be visited safely for short periods, but only with deliberate preparation. Extreme desert heat requires substantial hydration, appropriate clothing, prior heat acclimatization, and an understanding that general physical fitness is not the same as heat adaptation. This is exactly why the National Park Service tells visitors to avoid hiking after 10 o'clock in the morning during the summer. That recommendation isn't arbitrary. It's based on decades of incidents and reflects the point where the environment starts becoming dangerous for most people, no matter how physically fit they are. The warnings are posted all over the park and are difficult to miss. Meanwhile, their drive from Bakersfield wasn't going as planned. They got a late start, stopped in Mojave, spent some time at Badwater Basin, and by the time they arrived at the Golden Canyon Trailhead, they were already past the recommended cutoff time for summer hiking. Temperatures had already climbed above 125 degrees Fahrenheit and were still rising. They also passed active heat advisory signs at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center along the way, but they didn't stop.
And given those warnings, if it were me, I wouldn't have treated that as something that I could just push through.
At the trailhead, additional warnings advised hikers about extreme heat, recommended water quantities, and instructed visitors to turn around if they experienced dizziness, headache, or weakness. Alain walked past the sign without reading it. Trojan glanced at it but said nothing.
Trojan saw it, read some of it, and then just kept walking.
Each man carried two 16.9-ounce water bottles, giving them about 33 ounces of water each for the entire hike. For a hike of that length in Death Valley's summer conditions, National Park Service guidance recommends roughly 2 to 3 liters or 67 to 100 ounces per person. They had brought less than half that amount and carried no electrolyte supplements, hydration packs, or emergency supplies. Alan wore a gray cotton t-shirt, athletic shorts, and running shoes. He brought no hat and declined sunscreen that Neftar offered, believing his darker complexion and the short duration of the hike would provide sufficient protection.
Neftar had sunscreen and offered it to him. Alain said no, and I think that's a bad decision.
Both assumptions reflected ordinary experience rather than the realities of Death Valley in midsummer. The group also skipped the trail register, a system rangers use to narrow search efforts if hikers fail to return. They then entered Golden Canyon. The first part of the hike actually felt manageable. The unusual rock formations grabbed most of their attention, and Alain naturally drifted 30 to 40 feet ahead of the others, which was pretty normal for him during any kind of physical activity. But as they moved deeper into the canyon, things slowly started to change. Neftar had already gone through about half of his first water bottle, Trojan about a third, while Alain had only taken a few sips despite moving at a faster pace.
He was moving faster than both of them and drinking the least. That gap was already working against him, in my view.
The environment was changing too. As the canyon narrowed, the heat became much more intense. It wasn't just coming from the sun anymore. It was radiating from the canyon walls, the ground beneath them, and the open sky above, leaving almost no sense of relief anywhere around them. Alain still showed no signs of slowing down. Meanwhile, Trojan and Neftar gradually found themselves walking at a slower pace without really deciding to. Their attention shifted away from the scenery and towards simply managing their bodies in the heat. Alan continued ahead, still not acknowledging the conditions in the same way. Years of athletic training had conditioned him to dismiss discomfort as something to push through. In many environments, that mindset is useful. In extreme heat, however, discomfort is not an obstacle to overcome, but an early warning system. Eventually, Neftar decided he was turning back. He had already noticed he was going through his water much faster than he expected, and he realized he wasn't going to have enough left to safely finish the hike.
He made that call himself without anyone prompting him.
Trojan had been thinking the same thing and reached that conclusion on his own. Meanwhile, Elaine was already farther ahead on the trail. When they told him they were heading back, he didn't seem too concerned. He basically said the turnaround point was close and that there wasn't much reason to worry. Then he just kept walking. There wasn't any big discussion after that. Nobody made plans about where they'd meet later or talked about what to do if someone didn't come back on time.
No meeting point, no backup plan, just a quick exchange, and I think he was around the bend after that.
After a brief exchange, Trojan and Neftar turned around and started heading back toward the trailhead, while Elaine continued deeper into the canyon by himself. Before separating, Alan told his friends the trail was mostly flat, the turnaround point was close, and he expected to be back at the trailhead within 30 to 40 minutes. On paper, the estimate was reasonable. Under ordinary conditions, the remaining distance would have taken well under an hour. What his calculation failed to account for was how much the environment had already begun wearing him down. Elaine had consistently consumed less water than either Neftar or Trojan, despite moving at a faster pace. By the time he separated from them, he had only finished about half of his first bottle and had roughly 25 ounces remaining for the rest of the hike. He continued at the same brisk pace for a while, still assuming the hike remained manageable despite the worsening conditions. The canyon around him had become noticeably quieter without the presence of the other two. There was no longer anyone nearby to compare pace with, no one asking how he was feeling, and no outside perspective that might have challenged his decision to continue.
And what stands out to me is how that kind of confidence can still feel reasonable in the moment, even when the conditions around you are already starting to change in ways you don't fully realize yet.
Elaine eventually reached the Red Cathedral turnaround point where he briefly stopped, finished his first water bottle, and began heading back toward the trailhead. By then, his body was already under significant thermal stress. His return pace gradually slowed. The confident stride he had maintained earlier was beginning to disappear, replaced by shorter, more deliberate steps. The effort required to keep walking was steadily increasing. Eventually, Alen emptied his second and final water bottle while still nearly a mile from the trailhead.
A mile left and completely out of water. That, in my view, is the moment the hike stopped being manageable.
He was now completely without water in temperatures nearing 130 degrees Fahrenheit, surrounded by canyon walls and sun-baked ground that continued radiating heat from every direction. From that point onward, there was very little room for mistakes. He still had a considerable distance left to cover, but no remaining way to replace the fluids his body had already lost. His gray cotton t-shirt, which had been soaked with sweat earlier in the hike, now clung heavily to his body as he kept walking. The clothes that had seemed perfectly fine at the trailhead were no longer doing him any favors. By that point, he'd also spent well over an hour under direct midday sun without sunscreen. His face, neck, and forearms had been exposed to uninterrupted sunlight ever since they entered the canyon. As he continued toward the trailhead, the signs that something was changing became increasingly difficult to ignore. His pace continued to slow, and the confidence that had defined the first half of the hike was gradually being replaced by a body that was becoming harder and harder to manage. By that point, he was already much deeper into danger than he appeared to be. Around this stage of the return hike, an experienced hiking couple from Nevada, who had started their own hike much earlier in the morning, passed Elaine while heading back toward the trailhead. Both later provided consistent statements to park rangers. They described him as deeply flushed, unsteady on his feet, and unusually unresponsive. When they greeted him, he neither looked toward them nor acknowledged their presence.
He didn't even glance over when they spoke to him, just kept walking, staring straight ahead.
They kept walking because, at the time, nothing they saw immediately made it seem like he was in a life-threatening situation. He was still on his feet, still moving, and not very far from the trailhead. Under normal circumstances, that would have been a reasonable assumption to make. What they didn't realize was that his condition was already deteriorating. By that point, he was already showing signs consistent with severe heat illness, even though he was still able to walk on his own. Physical evidence later showed that Elaine's coordination continued to deteriorate as he made his way back toward the trailhead. Investigators documented footprints that gradually deviated 8 to 10 feet away from the marked path toward the East Canyon wall. Whether he intentionally moved there seeking relief or had already lost meaningful spatial awareness could not be determined. Both explanations are consistent with severe neurological impairment caused by extreme heat. By this stage, his body was rapidly running out of options. His limited water supply had already been exhausted, and the environmental conditions no longer allowed his thermoregulatory systems to keep up with the heat surrounding him. The air temperature exceeded normal skin temperature, the ground beneath him radiated extreme heat, and his body could no longer effectively dissipate the heat it was generating itself. By this stage, there were signs that his body was losing its ability to regulate its temperature. His cotton shirt, which had likely been soaked earlier in the hike, was only partially damp when he was found, suggesting that his sweating had already begun to diminish while he was still trying to make his way back toward the trailhead.
A shirt that should be completely soaked through, barely damp. I have to sit with that image every time.
Once that happened, the situation escalated rapidly. Severe dehydration reduced his blood volume, forcing his heart to work harder to maintain circulation while his body simultaneously struggled to cool itself. As his core temperature continued rising, his coordination, judgment, and spatial awareness would have progressively deteriorated alongside it. By this point, the environment was no longer something he was navigating successfully, but something his body was increasingly unable to overcome. Eventually, Alain made his way over to the East Canyon wall, but it didn't offer any relief at all. It was still sitting in direct sunlight and radiating heat back into the canyon instead of protecting him from it.
He went to that wall looking for something, shade, anything, and I think the wall had nothing to give him.
Whether he intentionally sat down there or simply collapsed is something no one can say for certain anymore. At that point, though, it didn't make much of a difference. Without water, without shade, and without anyone nearby to realize what was happening, he was no longer capable of getting himself back to safety. Meanwhile, Troyjan and Neftar were sitting in the parked car with the air conditioning running. The 30 to 40 minutes Alain had estimated had already come and gone, but there wasn't a specific moment when either of them suddenly panicked. The concern just slowly built over time. At first, they assumed there was a simple explanation. Maybe Alain had gone a little farther than he planned. Maybe he had stopped to take pictures near Red Cathedral. Maybe he was just walking more slowly on the way back.
I've sat in that kind of waiting, and I know exactly how those explanations feel. Completely reasonable, right up until they aren't.
None of those explanations sounded unreasonable at the time. But as the wait stretched on, those explanations became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the amount of time that had passed. Neftar eventually stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the trail entrance to look into the canyon, but the first bend limited visibility to only a few hundred feet. The two men briefly talked about what to do before deciding to go back into the canyon themselves. They didn't have much left to work with anymore. Between them, they only had part of a water bottle remaining after their own hike back and the time they had spent waiting in the parking area.
They were already worn down from their own hike out. Going back in was putting themselves at risk too.
Still, they couldn't just sit there any longer, so they re-entered the canyon. By then, conditions were likely even harsher than before. The sun had been beating down for hours, and the canyon walls and exposed ground had continued absorbing that heat and radiating it back into the narrow passageways. As they retraced their route, they kept expecting to eventually see Alain walking toward them. Instead, they spotted him sitting against the East Canyon wall about half a mile from the trailhead and several feet off the marked path. Immediately, they knew something was seriously wrong. He wasn't responding. His skin was dry and deeply flushed, and he was no longer sweating at all. His breathing was slow and irregular, with long pauses in between that made it difficult to tell when the next breath would come.
Those pauses between breaths, I can't imagine standing over someone and waiting for the next one to come.
Troyjan immediately called emergency services. Cell service inside the canyon was weak and unreliable, but the call stayed connected long enough for him to explain where they were and describe Alain's condition. The information was quickly relayed to National Park Service personnel at Furnace Creek, who immediately began coordinating an emergency response. Nearby, the experienced Nevada couple who had encountered Alain earlier in the day were speaking with a ranger at the parking area. As dispatch information circulated, they immediately realized the description matched the same hiker they had passed on the trail while he was still walking under his own power.
They passed him. They said hello, and now they're standing in a parking lot understanding what that moment actually was.
National Park Service personnel quickly initiated a rescue response. A helicopter was dispatched while ground rangers entered the canyon on foot. By the time rescuers reached Alain, he was unresponsive and had no detectable pulse. CPR was initiated at the scene before he was prepared for air transport and flown to Desert Valley Hospital in Victorville, California. Despite those efforts, he was later pronounced dead. His core temperature upon hospital arrival was 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The entire sequence, from separating from his friends to being found unresponsive inside the canyon, had unfolded in a little over an hour. National Park Service rangers later documented the scene, including Alain's position against the East Canyon wall, the footprints leading away from the trail, the location of both empty water bottles, the condition of his clothing, and the extensive UV damage visible on exposed skin. Trojan Delgado and Neftar Yi were interviewed separately by investigators, and their accounts were consistent with each other and with the physical evidence. Neither man was charged with any wrongdoing. Investigators concluded they had made appropriate decisions by turning back when they recognized the danger and by returning into the canyon once Alain failed to come back as expected. The incident was officially classified as an accidental death caused by environmental heat exposure. The Inyo County coroner later determined the cause of death to be hyperthermia, secondary to exertional heat stroke, with dehydration and prolonged sun exposure listed as contributing factors. The autopsy documented widespread heat-related cellular damage, early signs of kidney and liver injury, and severe UV damage across his face, neck, and forearms. No underlying medical conditions were identified, and toxicology results were negative. The amount of water he carried was also found to be dramatically insufficient for the conditions. A hike of that length in Death Valley's extreme summer heat would have required roughly 2 to 3 liters per person, while Alain had started with only 33 ounces. His death was ultimately recorded as one of Death Valley's recurring heat-related fatalities, incidents that continue to occur despite extensive warnings posted throughout the park. This story starts in July 16, 2019, with 4 gym buddies named Mason Price, Derek Alvarez, Silas Crane, and Tobias Renner. Mason was 29, Derek was 31, Silas was 28, Tobias was 30. They'd been training together for years at the same gym, and from what people who knew them said, they were the kind of friends who couldn't just lift weights together without turning it into some kind of contest. Who could bench more? Who could run faster? Who could go longer without eating before a workout?
You could pick literally anything, and these 4 had probably already argued about it. At some point, the conversation turned to endurance, and somebody brought up Death Valley. You've probably heard of it, even if you've never been close to it.
It's one of the hottest places on the planet during the summer, with temperatures that regularly climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Mason, Derek, Silas, and Tobias heard about how brutal the heat could get out there, and instead of filing that away as a fun fact, they turned it into a bet. Whoever gave up first on a hike through the park would owe the other 3 an entire year of gym membership fees.
I want to pause right here because this is the part that gets me every time I think about it. A year of membership fees is, what, maybe $600?
$800 if the gym is fancy. These 4 were about to risk their lives over something you could solve by just paying for your own membership and not betting it. That's the thing about competitive friendship sometimes. The stakes don't even have to make sense. It's never really about the money. It's about not being the one who backs down.
Here's where it also gets really interesting for me, and honestly also a little bit disturbing.
These 4 didn't just wake up one day and drive out to the desert. They spent almost 3 weeks planning this thing. Most of that planning focused on the challenge itself. They wanted an empty trail, uninterrupted footage, and a chance to prove they could handle conditions that most people avoided. Part of that meant not advertising the plan to people who might try to talk them out of it.
Think about that for a second.
They weren't breaking rules or entering restricted areas. The 4 hikers believed they were skilled and prepared enough to handle conditions that others couldn't. Despite repeatedly encountering warnings against strenuous hiking in extreme heat, they viewed those warnings as being meant for less capable people, not themselves. They thoroughly researched the trail, weather, maps, and trip reports, but ultimately underestimated the danger of the heat.
I think this is where their thinking went completely sideways, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Most people read a warning like that and think, okay, I shouldn't go.
These 4 read the same warning and thought, great, that means the trail will be empty. They took a list of reasons to stay away and flipped it into a list of reasons the plan would work. It's such a small shift in thinking, but it changes everything that happens after. During planning, the 4 men saw the extreme heat as an advantage rather than a danger. With fewer visitors during heat waves, they expected an empty trail where they could carry out their challenge without interference. To avoid encountering others, they chose a remote trail, picked a Tuesday instead of a busy weekend, and planned to start before sunrise. Their decisions were aimed at minimizing contact with anyone who might discourage them from continuing.
Now, before I go further into the story, I want to know your first reaction to hearing that they were actively trying to avoid people who might talk them out of it. Let me know in the comments.
Honestly, this part bugs me more than almost anything else in this story. They did real research, they weren't lazy about it, they just used all that information backward. It's like reading a manual on how a bomb works and concluding the best plan is to stand closer to it. As they researched more, their confidence grew instead of their caution. Studying maps, forecasts, and trail information gave them a false sense of expertise, leading them to believe that their fitness and gym experience would protect them from the desert's dangers. They increasingly viewed heat warnings as advice for unprepared tourists rather than for people like themselves. They also concealed key details from family and friends, describing the trip as ordinary sightseeing rather than a competitive challenge. They avoided discussing the wager, the specific trail, or their plans online, hoping to prevent experienced hikers from discouraging them. Their intention was to document the challenge and reveal it afterward as proof of the outcome. By the final week before the hike, isolation wasn't just a side effect of their planning anymore. It had become the goal. They pictured an empty trail where nobody could interrupt their competition. Nobody could see either of them quit, and nobody could tell them they'd gone too far. And here's the tragic irony of the whole thing. Every single safeguard they removed from their own plan was also a potential source of help that they were throwing away without realizing it. And the worst part is that their plan worked. It worked almost perfectly. The morning they set out, they barely saw anyone. No ranger happened to be in the area that morning, which wasn't unusual given the sheer size of Death Valley and how few people were hiking remote trails during extreme heat. No experienced hiker on the trail questioned their route or their timing. No friend called partway through the day to check in. All that privacy they worked so hard to build for themselves ended up meaning that when things started going wrong, there was nobody nearby who could recognize it and step in. Before they even started hiking, the four of them sat down and came up with a set of rules for their competition. And reading through what investigators later pieced together from their footage, these rules are almost unbelievable in how reckless they were. Not one of them was allowed to voluntarily quit without losing the bet outright. Any rest stop longer than 5 minutes counted as a sign of weakness. Any complaint about the heat or about being tired was treated as nothing more than an excuse. Every major checkpoint along the route had to be filmed as proof they'd actually reached it. And whoever made it to the turnaround point first would get extra bragging rights on top of winning the bet. So basically, in the span of a few sentences, a goofy competition between friends turned into a set of rules that actively punished either one of them for admitting they were struggling.
That's the part that really gets under my skin. They built a system where the smart decision, stopping, resting, turning around, was treated as failure.
They engineered their own peer pressure into the trip before they'd even taken a single step. They started hiking before the sun came up, just like they'd planned. For the first several miles, everything felt easy. The temperature was still relatively bearable in those early hours, and all four of them were full of energy. Their phones captured non-stop trash talk between them. Mason bragged that years of heavy lifting and serious conditioning had basically prepared him for anything the desert could throw at him. Derek pushed back, insisting that mental toughness mattered way more than any hydration plan or safety precaution. Silas claimed his trail experience put him a step ahead of everyone else. Tobias just laughed and said he'd settle the whole argument by finishing first.
Watching this part of the footage, if you didn't know how the story ended, you'd think you were watching four confident athletes treating a desert hike just like another gym challenge.
They laughed at the warning signs posted along the trail about extreme heat. They joked that people online had clearly exaggerated how bad it could get. The trail being nearly empty only made them more confident, because to them, every mile they covered without seeing another soul felt like proof their planning had paid off. At several points in the footage, they comment on how few people they've seen out there. Mason jokes that the whole park basically belongs to them now. Derek responds that this is exactly why they picked a weak forecast to experience some of the most extreme temperatures of the summer to do this.
I think this moment is honestly the saddest part of the early footage, even though nothing bad has really happened yet.
Not one of them understood that the emptiness around them wasn't a reward for being tough. It was a warning that almost everyone else had already decided the conditions were unsafe, and they were the only four who hadn't gotten the message yet. Once the sun actually rose, everything started changing fast. The landscape around them began throwing heat back at them from every direction. There were long stretches of trail with almost no shade anywhere in sight. Sweat poured off all four of them, and within a relatively short stretch of time, their shirts were completely soaked through. Derek noticed he was drinking a lot more water than he'd planned for. Mason developed a headache but brushed it off as just normal exertion from the hike. Silas started favoring one leg slightly but didn't say anything. Tobias felt his pace slipping but kept pushing to stay even with the others. Their conversations got shorter. The joking that had filled the early morning faded out. None of them said out loud that the effort was becoming harder than they'd expected. Instead, each guy looked at the others struggling and saw it as proof that the competition was actually working the way it was supposed to. The trail stayed mostly empty through this stretch. Hours passed without any real contact with another person. What had felt like freedom earlier in the morning now meant there was nobody around to notice just how quickly things were changing for the four of them. Heat radiated straight up from the sun-baked rock and dirt under their boots, and the ground itself seemed to be holding onto that warmth and throwing it right back at them. Like the whole desert was cooking them from every angle at once.
This is the point in the story where if you'd be a somewhat reasonable person, you would have turned around.
The headache, the sweat, the sudden water consumption, those are your body's early warning lights. But because they'd built this whole competition around punishing weakness, none one of them could let themselves see those warning signs for what they actually were. As the temperature kept climbing, the whole thing got more aggressive. The four of them started racing certain stretches of the trail. Whenever one guy stopped for even a brief moment, the others pushed ahead without him. Small breaks that should have been opportunities to rest turned into chances to gain an advantage in the competition. When Derek suggested taking a longer break at one point, Mason immediately mocked him for it on camera. When Mason started breathing heavily, climbing a steep section, Derek accused him of slowing down on purpose. When Silas asked if anyone else was feeling dizzy, Tobias brushed it off as nothing. None of them wanted to look weaker than the others, and their decisions, every single one of them at this point, were being driven by pride instead of by what their bodies were actually telling them. The environment that had felt totally manageable before sunrise now felt openly hostile. The air kept getting hotter with every hour that passed. Heat radiated up from the ground while the sun beat straight down on them from above, basically squeezing them between two sources of heat. And still, no one was willing to admit out loud that maybe they had underestimated exactly what the desert could do to them.
I keep coming back to this idea of pride overriding instinct, because I think it's the actual core of this whole tragedy. These weren't dumb guys.
They were fit, they were prepared on paper, they did their research. But pride is sneaky. It convinces you that admitting weakness is more dangerous than the actual physical danger you're standing in. And by this point in the hike, that's exactly the trap they'd fallen into. By mid-morning, all four of them realized they'd gone through way more water than they had planned for. Before the hike even started, each of them had packed roughly 2 gallons. During their research, they'd seen recommendations suggesting that extreme summer conditions could require far more water than that, especially on exposed routes, but everyone convinced themselves that their fitness and early start would make those estimates overly cautious. At the time, 2 gallons had seemed like more than enough. But a few hours into the heat, all 4 of them were shocked at how fast their supplies were disappearing. And instead of treating this discovery as a reason to slow down or turn back, it sparked a whole new competition between them. Rather than having an honest conversation about how to manage the situation safely, everyone became fixated on proving they were handling the heat better than the others. Derek started quietly rationing his water without saying anything. Mason started sneaking bigger gulps whenever nobody was watching. Silas began hiding how much he had left, while Tobias started timing his sips so the others wouldn't notice how thirsty he really was. They kept checking each other's bottles throughout the day. Nobody wanted to admit any concern, because in their minds, showing concern was basically the same thing as surrendering.
Gotta be honest, I shook my head on this one.
Because running out of water faster than expected in Death Valley in the summer should be an obvious, flashing red alarm. It's not a small detail. It's basically the most important warning your body and your supplies can give you out there, and these 4 looked at that warning and decided it was just another obstacle to push through rather than a reason to stop. As the temperature pushed toward genuinely dangerous levels, the first serious symptoms started showing up. Mason developed worsening headaches along with occasional dizziness. Derek started getting painful muscle cramps in his legs. Silas began losing his balance on flat ground. Tobias started slurring his words without noticing. All of them became increasingly irritable, started making small mistakes they normally wouldn't have made, and found themselves arguing over minor issues that hadn't seemed important earlier in the morning. Their pace noticeably slowed down. The video clips they were still recording got shorter, because by this point, just talking required real effort. Long silences started appearing between the recordings. In one clip, Mason struggled to remember a distance estimate he himself had mentioned earlier that same day. In another, Derek just pauses for several seconds, clearly trying to recall what the next checkpoint on their route was supposed to be. In one of Silas's last clear recordings, he repeats the same sentence twice without realizing it. Tobias, in his, just stares at the camera for several seconds before saying anything at all. All of them laughed these moments off when they happened. What made the situation especially dangerous was that the warning signs weren't arriving one at a time. Forgetfulness, irritability, poor decisions, physical exhaustion, and misplaced confidence were all beginning to overlap and reinforce one another. No one recognized them as warning signs, even though to anyone watching from the outside, and especially to anyone who knows anything about heat illness, those moments are about as clear a red flag as you can get. The heat at this point was becoming genuinely overwhelming. Temperatures kept rising while the four of them stayed out in the open, with basically no real protection from the sun. Mason kept pulling out the trail map and studying it, but he was struggling to interpret information that he'd reviewed in detail before the hike even started. Derek kept forgetting where he'd packed certain pieces of equipment in his own backpack. Silas kept asking the others how far they'd already gone, even though he'd asked minutes before. Tobias kept stopping to check a checkpoint marker that wasn't actually there yet. Simple conversations between them started turning into arguments. They debated distances they had already covered together. They disagreed about how much water was actually left between them. They kept asking each other questions that had already been answered just minutes earlier. Mason noticed that Derek was becoming unusually forgetful and irritable, but he chalked it up to exhaustion, making his friend dramatic. Derek noticed Mason struggling with basic navigation decisions, but he dismissed it as Mason just being stubborn. Silas noticed Tobias slurring his words, but figured he was just tired. Tobias noticed Silas stumbling, but assumed he'd twisted his ankle. None of them stopped to consider that they were all actively showing signs of heat-related cognitive impairment.
I want to slow down here for a second because I want to stress out that heat exhaustion and heat stroke don't just hurt your body.
They hurt your brain. They mess with your ability to recognize that something is wrong in the first place. So you end up with this horrible situation where the exact thing that's putting you in danger is also the thing stealing away your ability to notice the danger. These four weren't just getting physically weaker. Their judgment, the one tool that could have saved them, was breaking down right along with everything else. By late morning, all four men were showing obvious signs of severe heat stress, and yet none of them believed they were actually in serious danger. Mason kept insisting on camera that he felt fine, even while he was visibly stumbling on flat ground. Derek laughed off his own symptoms, claiming he'd pushed through worse during regular gym workouts. Silas insisted his balance issues were just an old knee injury acting up. Tobias claimed he was talking slow on purpose, like it was some kind of joke. Their videos from this stretch capture increasingly irrational conversations. They talked about completing extra mileage after finishing the challenge, like they were planning some kind of victory lap. They made wildly unrealistic estimates about how quickly they could finish the rest of the route. To anyone watching this footage afterward, it's obvious almost instantly that none of them was thinking clearly anymore. But to the four of them, in that moment, everything still felt completely manageable. As the temperature kept climbing, all of their phones started showing overheating warnings after extended periods of recording in direct sunlight. Recording became more and more sporadic as the devices repeatedly shut down the camera function until they could cool back down. Even their equipment was struggling to survive out there, and somehow that still didn't register as a sign for any of them to stop. Eventually, the tension between them boiled over completely. Mason started blaming Derek for encouraging the challenge in the first place. Derek blamed Mason for picking an overly ambitious route. Silas blamed Tobias for talking everyone into a remote trail instead of a marked one. Tobias blamed Silas for insisting they push through midday instead of resting in the shade. They accused each other of wasting water. They accused each other of slowing down the pace and dragging the whole thing out. The argument kept escalating and getting more confused as it went. None of them could really articulate what they were even upset about anymore. Small, minor grievances turned into full-blown confrontations. Eventually, the argument shifted toward their remaining water and what direction they should take next. Derek wanted to slow down and reconsider the route. Mason accused him of using that as an excuse to quit. Derek fired back that Mason had pushed them too far into the heat. Silas sided with Mason, Tobias sided with Derek. After several increasingly confused arguments about water, pace, and navigation, the group split into two pairs, each one going their own direction. Each of them had convinced himself that the others were the entire reason the day had gone so badly.
I want you to imagine that scenario. Four guys who started the day as best friends and training partners ended up splitting apart from each other.
Alone, in one of the hottest places on Earth, because their judgment had deteriorated to the point where teaming up felt worse than going it alone.
If there's a single decision in this entire story that sealed their fate, I think it's this one.
Once they separated, all 4 of their conditions got worse fast. Mason kept recording occasional updates on his phone, and honestly, the footage from this stretch is hard to watch. He repeats the same observations multiple times without seeming to realize he's already said them. He struggles to hold the phone steady, his speech becomes increasingly disorganized and hard to follow. At one point in the recordings, he even seems uncertain about which direction he's actually traveling in. Investigators later determined that he gradually wandered away from the route they had originally planned, likely without even realizing it. Silas, who'd paired off with Mason, his final recordings show him sitting motionless for long stretches, occasionally mumbling about needing to catch up to the others. Derek's decline looked a little different. He started sitting down repeatedly for what he believed were just brief rests, but each stop ended up lasting longer than the one before it. He began leaving pieces of equipment behind along the trail because carrying them simply felt too exhausting. Investigators later used those abandoned items to piece together a rough timeline of his decline as the day went on. His final recordings are full of long pauses and incomplete thoughts that just trail off. Several recordings he apparently tried to make were never even completed because his phone kept overheating after sitting exposed to direct sunlight on the open trail. Tobias, paired with Derek, drifted away from him gradually, the two losing sight of each other without either one noticing exactly when it happened.
Can't even begin to imagine how alone they all were by this point, even though they'd started the morning literally side by side.
The whole point of their plan had been privacy, no interference, no witnesses, and now here they were, each one fading away separately, with nobody around to notice and absolutely nobody to help. By early afternoon, all 4 men were suffering from severe heat illness, with many of the symptoms later believed by investigators to be consistent with heat stroke, and none of them was capable of making sound decisions anymore. Basic movement had become incredibly difficult. Distances that should have taken just minutes to cover stretched out far longer than that. Their remaining water disappeared completely. The videos from this point on are fragmented and confusing, with large gaps appearing between recordings. None of them fully acknowledged just how severe the situation had become. All of them kept holding on to the belief that they could recover after resting just a little bit longer. None of them did. When Mason, Derek, Silas, and Tobias didn't come home that night, their families eventually reported them missing. Search teams started retracing likely routes through the park, but the investigation initially had to consider several possible paths. Since none of the families had any idea about the wager or the specific challenge the 4 men had actually planned, all they'd been told was that it was a simple sightseeing trip. Searchers eventually located all 4 men, scattered miles apart from each other, exactly where their decision to split up had left them. They were dead for multiple hours already. Their phones held dozens of short video clips, interrupted recordings, GPS data, and timestamps documenting that slow slide from confidence at sunrise to confusion by the afternoon. Using GPS data, the abandoned gear scattered along the trail, timestamps from the videos, and the footage itself, investigators were able to reconstruct large portions of the day's events, although significant gaps remained where no recordings existed and none of the men were present to explain exactly what happened. What that footage ultimately revealed is that none of them died because of one single mistake. They spent hours making increasingly poor decisions while their judgment slowly broke down in the extreme heat. One small bad call after another, until there was nothing left to fall back on. A challenge that started as a test of who had more endurance ended up becoming something much darker, a demonstration of just how fast even 4 genuinely fit, capable guys can lose the ability to recognize danger once heat illness really takes hold.
And that, to me, is the whole reason this story has stuck. It wasn't recklessness in one big dramatic moment. It was recklessness built quietly, decision by decision, until there was no way out left. It was the 9th of July, 2018, and the South Kaibab trailhead on the Grand Canyon's south rim was already filling with hikers by 6 a.m. The South Kaibab Trail is one of the most spectacular and most dangerous day hiking routes in the national park system. Unlike the nearby Bright Angel Trail, South Kaibab has no water anywhere along its length, no pipe stations, no creek, nothing. It also has almost no shade. What makes the canyon so deceptive is that it is upside down compared to a mountain. On a mountain, the hard part comes first. You climb when you are fresh and descend when you are tired, and the summit is a natural turnaround that forces a decision. The canyon reverses all of that. The easy part, the descent, comes first, when you are fresh and the air is cool. The hard part, the climb, comes last, when you are tired, dehydrated, and the day has heated up. There is no summit to force a turnaround, just an endless invitation to go a little deeper. Everything about the experience is built, almost perfectly, to lure people past the point they can safely return from. Rangers understand this. Most first-time visitors do not. The park lives with the consequences of that gap every summer. Rangers and volunteers patrol the upper sections of these trails, specifically to catch people heading down unprepared, turning back hikers who have too little water, too little time, or too little understanding of what the heat will do to them. They hand out warnings, they ask pointed questions, they have talked countless people out of a hike that would have hurt them. But they cannot be everywhere, and they cannot stop someone who looks fit, moves well, and gives every appearance of knowing exactly what they are doing. The people who slip through are very often the ones who least look like they need stopping. Renee Calloway was 38 years old and lived in Denver. She was a competitive amateur trail runner who had completed multiple ultramarathons, including 2 50-mile mountain races, and who routinely logged 15 to 20-mile training runs through the foothills and high country around the Front Range. She was lean, exceptionally fit, and accustomed to a body that did whatever she asked of it. Friends described her as someone who treated difficult terrain as a kind of conversation, something to engage with rather than fear. She had run high mountain trails in brutal cold and thin air. She had pushed through the kind of fatigue in races that sends most people to medical tents. Her fitness was not a hobby. It was central to who she was. She had spent 15 years building that capability. She ran 6 days a week. She tracked her heart rate, her sleep, her recovery. She had a coach for her race seasons and a circle of running friends who treated long suffering on a trail as a form of fun. In the world she lived in, the body was a tool you sharpened, and discomfort was just information you learned to push past. That worldview had served her well across hundreds of races and training runs in the mountains of Colorado, where the danger was altitude and cold and the occasional storm, all things she understood and respected. What she did not have was any real experience with heat. Denver summers are warm but dry and mild compared to the desert Southwest, and her training was done at altitude where temperatures stay moderate. She had never trained in genuine extreme heat, had never felt what 110 degrees does to a working body, and had no instinct for how fast and how completely heat can take a person apart. Her mental model of difficulty was built entirely around cold, altitude, distance, and fatigue, the dangers she knew. The desert had a different one waiting for her, and it was not on her radar at all. She was at the Grand Canyon for a short solo trip, a few days of driving and sightseeing between races. She had no major hike planned. The canyon was a stop, not a destination. I'll be honest, she wasn't careless, she was capable, but sometimes the canyon punishes capable far harder than it punishes careless. On the morning of July 9th, she drove to the canyon and rode the shuttle bus out to the South Kaibab trailhead, which sits on a stretch of road closed to private vehicles, intending to do something small. Her plan, as later reconstructed from her messages and the account of a person who saw her at the trailhead, was to walk down to the first overlook, a popular spot called Ooh-Ah Point that sits less than a mile down the trail, take in the view, take a few photos, and walk back up. A 40-minute outing at most. Something to stretch her legs and see the canyon up close before getting back in the car. The night before, she had texted a friend that she might do a quick sunrise walk at the canyon before driving on. Nothing serious, just to see it properly. That was the entire scope of the plan, in her own words. A quick walk, nothing serious. For a woman who considered a 20-mile mountain run a normal Tuesday, a stroll to a viewpoint less than a mile away did not register as an activity that required preparation of any kind. Because that was the plan, she brought nothing. No water, no pack, no food. She had her phone, sunglasses, and a light long-sleeve layer tied around her waist. She was dressed for a casual morning, not for the canyon. To her, bringing water for a 40-minute walk to a viewpoint would have seemed almost absurd, the same way you wouldn't fill a hydration pack to walk to your mailbox. The problem was that the Grand Canyon is not a neighborhood, and the trail she was about to step onto does not behave like a walk to a viewpoint, no matter how short the first stretch of it feels. I genuinely can't wrap my head around someone carrying a phone but no water into the Grand Canyon in July. A person at the trailhead thought they remembered her days later, when investigators were asking around. While most hikers nearby were adjusting loaded packs and hydration bladders, this woman, as they recalled it, had walked past the warning signs with nothing in her hands but a phone. Memory at a crowded trailhead is a fragile thing, and the account was never something anyone could fully confirm, but it fit the one detail that was not in question.
that when she was found, there was no water container on her or anywhere near her. Put together, the picture was of a woman who had walked into the canyon with nothing to drink, though exactly how that choice got made, no one would ever really know. The warning signs at the South Kaibab trailhead are not subtle. They show a graphic of a strong young person and state directly that people exactly like that die in the canyon from heat, that going down is optional, but coming up is mandatory, and that hikers should not attempt to go too far. Renee, by every account, walked past them without slowing down. They were written for someone else, someone less capable, someone who needed the warning. That was the assumption anyway.
I've stood at trailheads like that at dawn. It's cool and breezy, and I promise your body has no idea what's actually coming.
The early morning descent was effortless. For a trained ultra runner, walking downhill on a well-graded trail in cool morning air is barely exercise. Renee reached Ooh-Ah Point in roughly 15 minutes. The view was extraordinary, the canyon opening up in layers of red and gold in the early light. She took her photos, and then, instead of turning around, she kept going.
I've made this exact mistake on a fun downhill, telling myself just one more bend, and that instinct is the deadly one here.
This is the part of the canyon that gets people, and it has nothing to do with fitness. The descent feels wonderful. Every step down reveals a new view, a deeper layer, a more dramatic perspective. The next landmark always feels close. There is a psychological pull to a descending trail that is genuinely hard to resist, a sense that the real reward is always just a little further down, around the next bend, past the next ridge. For someone whose entire life had trained her to keep going when her body felt good, the pull was almost irresistible. Her body felt good, better than good.
Now this is the exact spot where I'd have grabbed her arm or something, because a sensible plan dies down here, one pretty view at a time.
Renee continued down to Cedar Ridge, a flat saddle about 1.5 miles in and 1,100 feet down, a common turnaround point with a pit toilet but no water. She felt strong. She felt better than strong. She felt like she was barely working. Cedar Ridge is where a lot of sensible day hikers stop, take in the view, and head back up, and even that climb sends plenty of them back to the rim tired. Renee barely paused, so she kept going. The canyon changed character as she dropped. The vegetation thinned. The walls rose higher on either side, throwing the morning into sharp lines of light and shadow. The air, so pleasant at the rim, grew noticeably warmer with every few hundred feet of descent, the way it does when you walk down into a basin that traps heat. She was descending into a different climate entirely, one layer of rock at a time, and the cool morning she had started in was being left behind above her with every switchback. None of it felt alarming. It felt like progress, like the reward for going a little further, which is exactly how the canyon draws people down.
The way I see it, every step down a canyon is like a loan, and South Kaibab collects the whole thing on the way back up.
Below Cedar Ridge, the trail steepens and the exposure increases. Renee continued down to Skeleton Point, 3 miles in and about 2,000 feet below the rim. Skeleton Point is the spot where the trail offers its first full view of the Colorado River far below, and it is the absolute maximum that the Park Service suggests for a summer day hike, with heavy warnings even then. By the time she reached it, the sun had climbed well above the canyon walls, and the temperature was rising fast. It was approaching 9 a.m. The cool morning was gone. Skeleton Point is where the trail finally reveals the Colorado River, a thin green ribbon impossibly far below, and it is genuinely one of the great views in the American Southwest. It is also, for a summer day hiker, a finish line disguised as a waypoint. The park asks people to treat it as the absolute turnaround, and for good reason. Everything beyond it is steeper, hotter, and further from help. Renee stood at that view with 2,000 feet of climbing already banked beneath her, feeling strong enough to think the river itself might be reasonable. It was not reasonable. It was never reasonable. But nothing in her body was telling her that yet. She had now descended 2,000 feet on no water in steadily increasing heat, and she felt, by every internal signal her body was sending, completely fine. This is the trap precisely. A person of Renee's fitness could descend another 1,000 feet and still feel capable. Her cardiovascular system was so efficient and her pain tolerance so high that the early warnings most people feel, the heaviness, the thirst, the small voice that says turn around, either weren't registering yet or were easy to dismiss. Her body had spent 15 years learning to ignore exactly those signals. That training, which made her a great athlete, had effectively disabled the alarm system that the canyon was depending on to send her back. A normal hiker arrives at Skeleton Point already tired, already thirsty, already aware that the climb back is going to be miserable, and that awareness is protective. It makes them turn around. Renee arrived at Skeleton Point feeling fresh. And feeling fresh at the deepest point most people are willing to go is not a sign of safety. It is a sign that you have the capacity to get into far more trouble than the average person, and no internal brake to stop you.
I want to just yell it at the screen. Feeling great that deep in a waterless canyon isn't safety, it's the danger just being set even more.
Renee continued past Skeleton Point. Exactly how far she went is something investigators could only estimate from her photos and the handful of points where people thought they saw her, but the best reconstruction had her descending toward the area approaching the tip-off, roughly 4.5 miles in and around 3,000 feet below the rim. Somewhere in this stretch, the heat finally reached her. The temperature this far down by mid-morning was likely well above 100 degrees. She had been moving for close to 3 hours with no water, and the first real symptoms arrived: a headache, a dryness she couldn't ignore, the first flicker of doubt.
She turned around because she might have thought that at that point, turning around meant she was safe, and I wish that were true, but this is the moment the real fight starts.
The problem was that turning around at 3,000 feet down is not the solution it feels like. It is the beginning of the hardest and most dangerous part. She now had to climb 3,000 vertical feet in fully exposed terrain, in rapidly intensifying heat, with no water and a body that had already started its slide. To put that climb in perspective, 3,000 feet of vertical gain is comparable to climbing the stairs of a 200-story building, except the stairs are uneven rock, the air is over 100 degrees, the sun is directly overhead with no shade, and there is no water at the top of any flight. The ascent is where the canyon does its real work. Climbing is metabolically expensive, it generates enormous internal heat, and that heat has to be shed through sweat. Sweating requires water. Renee had none. Within the first few hundred feet of climbing, her pace, which had been so effortless going down, collapsed. She was stopping frequently, seeking the thin slivers of shade thrown by the occasional rock outcrop, her heart rate climbing, her head pounding. The same trail that had felt like a gift on the way down had become a furnace she had to fight through step by step.
I can't stress this enough. You don't tough out a core temperature. No one has ever taught her that. You can't tough that kind of thing out. It's not possible.
I can't stress this enough. You do not tough out a core temperature, and nobody had ever once taught her that. For the first time in maybe her entire athletic life, Renee was encountering a situation that effort could not solve. In a race, when things get hard, you dig deeper, you push, you summon the will to keep going, and that works because the limiting factor is usually your own discomfort tolerance. In the canyon, the limiting factor was water and core temperature, and no amount of will produces water or sheds heat. Her single greatest asset, the ability to push her body past where other people quit, was useless here. And worse than useless, because it kept her moving and generating heat when stopping might have bought her time. The deterioration was not dramatic from the outside, which is part of what makes heat illness so insidious. There was no single moment of collapse, just a steady erosion. Her steps got shorter, her rest stops got longer and closer together. The headache that had started as a dull pressure became something she could feel behind her eyes. She was sweating less than she should have been, which she might have read as relief if she had known anything about heat, when in fact it is one of the worst signs there is. Her body was running low on the water it needed to keep cooling itself, and it was starting to make hard decisions about where to send what little remained. She would climb a short stretch, then stop, hands on her knees, waiting for a heart rate that would not come down the way it always had. The shade she chased kept getting smaller and farther apart as the sun climbed higher, until there was barely any shade left at all. Her mouth had gone past thirst into something drier and more frightening. Her thinking, when she tried to plan, kept sliding off the task, the simple math of how far she had to go and how long it would take refusing to add up in her head. She was still moving, still pointed uphill, still doing the one thing her whole life had taught her to do, which was to keep going. It was the wrong thing, and there was no longer any part of her clear enough to know it. There is a specific cruelty to the way the inner canyon holds heat. The rock absorbs the sun all morning and then radiates it back, so that by the middle of the day, a hiker is being cooked from above by direct sun and from below and beside by stone that has turned into a kind of oven. Ground level temperatures on an exposed trail can run well above whatever the official forecast number says. For a body already low on water and fighting to cool itself, that extra load is enormous. Renee was climbing through the hottest hours of the day into the hottest part of the canyon, and every foot of elevation she gained was also a foot deeper into the conditions the rangers warn about most. The math of it was simple and merciless. She was making heat faster than she could shed it, she had no water to spend on cooling, and the rock around her was pouring still more heat into the equation. There was only one way that equation ever resolves, and the canyon was already solving it.
Heat does not negotiate. It doesn't care in the slightest how many miles a person has run in their life.
On a trail as busy as South Kaibab, plenty of people passed her that morning, and working out afterward who had actually seen her, and when, was never clean.
The account investigators leaned on most came from a man who had been descending with his teenage son. Somewhere in the late morning, he said, he passed a woman sitting on a rock in a patch of shade, flushed and breathing hard. He asked if she was okay. She told him she was fine, just resting, that she'd gone further than she meant to. He offered her water, and as he remembered it, she hesitated, took a few swallows from his bottle, then waved off more, saying he'd need it and that she was almost back up anyway. If it was her, and the details fit, she was not almost back up. She was over 2,000 feet below the rim. He said she sounded normal, maybe a little embarrassed about having gone too far, the way a capable person sounds when they have slightly miscalculated and don't want to make it a thing. There was no slurring, no obvious confusion, nothing that screamed emergency. That is part of what makes these situations so hard for the people who cross paths with them. By the time someone is visibly, unmistakably in crisis from heat, they are often already past the point where a few swallows of water and good intentions can save them. Renee was in that in-between zone, where she still seemed like a fit adult who had simply overdone it, and she presented herself that way because in her own mind, that is exactly what was happening. It wrecks me that she waved off more water just to be polite here. A few swallows was never gonna save her. The man said he had no reason at the time to think she was in serious danger. He and his son continued down. He told investigators later that he thought about her for a long time afterward. The heat in the canyon kept climbing toward its midday peak, and Renee kept climbing into it. The symptoms she was now feeling marking the progression of heat exhaustion toward heat stroke, the most dangerous heat-related condition there is. Her body, unable to cool itself without water, was losing the fight to regulate its core temperature. The headache intensified. Nausea set in. Her coordination began to slip. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke exist on a continuum, and the line between them is where it becomes life-threatening. In heat exhaustion, the body is struggling but still managing, sweating heavily, the person weak and nauseated but mentally present. Heat stroke is when the cooling system fails entirely. The core temperature climbs past the point the body can tolerate, and as it does, the brain itself begins to be affected. Once core temperature passes roughly 104 degrees, organ damage begins, and the swelling that follows produces confusion, disorientation, and eventually unconsciousness. What honestly scares me about heat stroke is that it steals your judgment at the exact moment that you need every bit of it. As Renee's core temperature climbed, her ability to make rational decisions, to recognize how much trouble she was in, to ration her energy, or even think about calling for help was eroding. And her lifetime of pushing through discomfort, the exact trait that made her a successful ultra runner, was now telling her to keep going when keeping going was killing her. The internal voice that had carried her through 50-mile races, the one that said, "You can handle this, keep moving," was the worst possible advisor in this specific situation, and it was the loudest voice she had. And it genuinely stings how every gift that made her great at racing turned into a liability the second that heat hit her. This is the part that separates heat deaths from almost every other kind of trail accident. There was no fall, no broken bone, no sudden catastrophe she could react against. The thing killing Renee was invisible and internal, a number climbing inside her own body, and the only treatment was the one thing she did not have and could not reach. Shade slowed it down. Rest slowed it down. But without water, and without a way to truly cool her core, slowing it down only stretched out the time. It did not change the direction. By late morning, her phone showed no reliable signal in most of the inner canyon, and even if it had, the decline of advancing heat stroke makes a coherent call for help less and less likely. Every ranger I've read says the same thing. The one who dies out here aren't necessarily the weak, they're the strong who ignore the warnings. She climbed back up toward Skeleton Point through the late morning and into the worst heat of the day, slower and slower, gaining maybe 1,000 feet from her turnaround in conditions that were now brutal. Another pair of hikers thought they might have seen her later on, a woman off the side of the trail who did not seem to be moving much, though they could not be sure it was her and could not place the time beyond sometime before midday. They assumed, like everyone else, that she was just resting in the shade. The canyon was full of people resting in shade that morning. By the time anyone realized she was not resting, it was far too late. Somewhere just below Skeleton Point, Renee stopped for the last time. She moved off the trail into a thin band of shade beneath a rock outcrop, and there, alone, with no water and no way to cool down, and no signal to call for help, her body finished what the heat had started. The sweating had already stopped. The cooling system was already gone. Her core temperature had climbed past the point a body can survive. And in that sliver of shade, roughly 2,000 feet below the rim, Renee Callaway died. Still 1,000 feet and several brutal hours short of the rim, she had walked away from that morning, expecting to be back at by mid-morning. I want her remembered for this. She clawed 1,000 feet back uphill with no water before her body quit. That's not weakness. When she didn't turn up or answer her messages the next day, the friend she had texted about a sunrise walk grew worried and called the park. Her car was found in a lot near the rim, and once the scattered sightings were gathered up, searchers concentrated on South Kaibab and found her there. She had no water container on her or anywhere near her, and an autopsy by the medical examiner confirmed hyperthermia, no heart problem, and no hidden condition. Just a healthy and extremely fit 38-year-old woman killed by a walk she thought would take 40 minutes. Much of her last day had to be pieced together rather than known. From the photos, the few people who crossed her path, and the hard physical facts of where she lay, but the shape of what happened to her was never really in doubt. Renee came to the Grand Canyon as one of the fittest people on the trail that morning, and it changed nothing, because the canyon doesn't reward strength. It rewards respect, and nobody had ever taught her the difference. She walked down with no water because she was only going a little way, and then the canyon showed her one more view, and one more, until there was no version of the climb back her body could survive. She didn't die because she was weak. She died because she was strong in the one place on Earth where being strong was the most dangerous thing she could be. It was June 14th, 2018. The Arkansas River runs through the heart of south-central Colorado, cutting through a canyon called Browns Canyon just outside the small town of Buena Vista. Buena Vista sits at about 8,000 feet above sea level, nestled between the Collegiate Peaks to the west and the Sangre de Cristo Range to the east. The town has a population of maybe 3,000 people on a normal day, but during the rafting season, which runs from late May through August, depending on snowmelt, it can feel like the whole country has shown up with a dry bag and a bucket list. Browns Canyon is a national monument now, and it's one of the most popular whitewater destinations in the entire country. Thousands of people float that stretch every year, from nervous first-timers on guided group trips to experienced kayakers running technical lines solo. The commercial outfitter industry there is well-established, heavily regulated, and safety-focused in ways that go well beyond what most tourists ever think about. I've spent time looking into how these trips are run, and the level of operational detail is genuinely impressive. Every guide is certified. Every life jacket or personal flotation device, PFD, in the industry's language is fitted individually to each guest before the trip. Weight limits, water temperature protocols, swimmer rescue procedures, it's all documented, trained, and audited. The outfitters operating in Browns Canyon don't survive on luck. They survive on reputation and compliance. That context matters a lot for what happened that day. I want you to hold it in your head, not just as background flavor, but as a structural fact. The system in place was a good one. What went wrong was not the absence of safety infrastructure. It was a series of decisions made inside that infrastructure that dismantled it piece by piece. On the morning of June 14th, the outfitter running this particular trip, I'll call them the company throughout, had a full day of multi-raft groups heading out on a half-day section that included a stretch of Class 3 and Class 4 rapids. For context, Class 3 water means moderate waves and clear channels that require maneuvering. Class 4 steps that up significantly. Powerful, churning water, more complex routes, less room for error. You can absolutely run Class 4 in a guided group raft. People do it every summer. But it demands that everyone on that raft follow the guide's instructions, stay seated, keep their PFD on, and listen. The guide assigned to one of the rafts that morning was a man named Tom Sobolov. Tom was in his late 20s at this point, and he had been guiding in Colorado for several seasons. He wasn't a rookie. He knew the river, knew the equipment, and by all accounts from the company's internal records and later investigative documentation, he had a solid track record. No prior incidents, no complaints on file, no disciplinary history. He was the kind of guide you'd actually want on your raft. Miriam McDade was on his raft, along with her date, a man I'll call Devin, and several other guests. Miriam was 53 years old, originally from the Phoenix area, and she was visiting Colorado on what appeared to be a leisure trip. She had booked the rafting experience a few days in advance through the company's standard reservation system. Nothing in the booking records flagged any medical conditions or swimming ability concerns, which customers are asked to disclose at the time of booking and again during pre-trip check-in. Whether or not she had read through those pre-trip materials carefully is something we simply don't know. A lot of people don't. They skim past the liability waiver, nod along
along during the safety briefing and assume the life jacket is mostly there for show. On most trips, on most days, nothing bad happens, and that assumption never gets tested. That day on the Arkansas, it got tested hard. Before any raft leaves the staging area, every guest gets fitted for a personal flotation device, or PFD.
You have to understand that this isn't a handshake deal where they toss you a vest and wish you luck.
The guide, or a staging assistant, physically fits the device to the guest's body, checks the buckles, tests the snugness, and makes sure the PFD will stay in place in the water. There's a reason for all of that. A loose PFD can ride up over a swimmer's face in moving water. A PFD that isn't buckled properly can come off entirely. The fitting process exists because the physics of whitewater don't care about comfort levels. According to the incident report that was later reviewed during the investigation, Miriam had difficulties during the fitting process. The standard PFD issued to her was correctly sized for her body weight, but she expressed discomfort with how it felt specifically, that it was too tight across the chest. Tom adjusted it. She said it was still too tight. He adjusted it again. This back and forth lasted long enough that it drew attention at the staging area, with other guests and staff aware that something was taking longer than usual. At this point, before Tom had even finished the second adjustment, Miriam began complaining about the appearance of the PFD itself. She made repeated comments that the vest looked old and worn, pointing at faded stitching and minor cosmetic scuffs that had no bearing on the device's functionality. Several staging employees later recalled her demanding to see a newer life jacket, as if she were returning a defective product at a department store. When staff explained that all PFDs met the same safety certifications regardless of cosmetic condition, she rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about how this place was clearly cutting corners. During this process, Miriam began to escalate, not physically, but vocally. She was loud about her discomfort, dismissive about what she characterized as Tom's inability to solve the problem, and according to at least one account documented in the investigation, she made comments to a staging supervisor that implied Tom didn't know what he was doing. What we can't know for certain is whether she genuinely believed the PFD was improperly fitted, or whether she simply found it uncomfortable in the way that any properly fitted PFD will feel uncomfortable snug, slightly restrictive, not designed for casual lounging. The two are very different problems with very different solutions.
But I get that they can feel identical to someone who has never worn one before and has no framework for what correct is supposed to feel like.
Unfortunately, they got a Karen in their hands. Before the staging supervisor even arrived, Miriam had already started making comments to other guests in the raft area, attempting to rally them to her side. She asked a young couple nearby whether their PFDs felt dangerously tight, and when they said theirs seemed fine, she told them they must not know what to look for. She also made a point of announcing loudly that she had left a bad review for a different outfitter last year and would have no problem doing the same here. The other guests later described feeling embarrassed for her, not threatened by her, but the performance continued regardless. There's also a third possibility worth acknowledging, that Miriam understood on some level that the PFD was fine, but that pushing back on it was a way of asserting control in a situation where she felt she had none.
This is not a psychology podcast, and I'm not going to armchair diagnose anyone here.
But the pattern of behavior resistance, escalation, demanding a personnel change follows a recognizable script. It's the script of someone who is accustomed to getting what they want through social pressure and is deploying that skill in a context where it has no place.
I want you to watch carefully, because what happens next is the part that set everything else in motion.
The staging supervisor, a man I'll call Garrett, came over to assess the situation. Miriam immediately shifted her complaints from the equipment to Tom's demeanor. She claimed, without any corroboration, that Tom had been rude to her and had rolled his eyes when she first asked for an adjustment. Garrett later testified that he saw no evidence of this and that Tom had remained professional throughout. But Miriam pressed harder, insisting that she did not feel safe with Tom and that if the company forced her to raft with him, she would demand a full refund and contact her credit card company to dispute the charge. The word refund came up multiple times in the staging area that morning. Again, the investigation documents this, though the full picture had to be reconstructed from multiple sources since Miriam herself was not available to give a statement afterward. Garrett's own account, given to both company management and later to investigators, was that Miriam's complaints were persistent and that she requested Tom be removed from her raft.
Whether that request was phrased politely or not is not really something I can verify, but the outcome is documented.
Garrett made the call to reassign the guests on Tom's raft to another guide, and Tom was pulled from his shift.
That decision to remove a certified experienced guide based on a guest complaint during the pre-launch safety process is one that I think deserves real scrutiny, and we'll come back to it. But first, let's talk about what it means for a guide to be pulled mid-staging. In the operational structure of a commercial outfitter, the staging supervisor has a significant amount of discretionary authority. They're responsible for the overall safety and smooth function of the launch process, and they have to make judgment calls quickly. On one hand, if a guest and a guide have a genuine interpersonal conflict that can't be resolved, splitting them up can be a reasonable move. On the other hand, the safety fitting process is not a customer service interaction. It is a literal safety procedure. Tom, by the account in the investigation, did not argue. He handed off his raft to another guide, a less experienced staff member I'll call Ruben, and stepped back. The trip launched, and Tom stood at the staging area and watched it go. Apparently, Miriam made a point of watching him walk away with what witnesses described as a satisfied expression. She then turned to Devin, her date, and said something in a low voice that made him shift uncomfortably. One guest in an adjacent raft later recalled hearing Miriam say, "That's how you get things done," as if she had just successfully negotiated a hotel room upgrade rather than having a trained professional removed from a safety-critical position. Devin, by all accounts, did not respond. If I were him, I'd want to disappear into the raft floor, but I want to sit with that image for a second here too. Tom was a professional. He knew that raft, that group, that river. He had been in the middle of a safety-critical task when he was pulled from it. He complied, because that's what a professional does when a supervisor makes a call, even a bad one. But he also knew, at least in general terms, that the PFD situation on that raft had not been fully resolved. What he did or didn't say in those final moments at the staging area isn't documented in a way I can report as fact. But the investigation found that no adequate communication bridge was built between him and Ruben before the raft went into the water. What the investigation later zeroed in on was the question of what happened to the PFD situation when the handoff occurred. Tom had been in the middle of a fitting dispute. He knew the status of that PFD better than anyone else on the property at that moment. Ruben, stepping in cold, was receiving a group of guests mid-process, with no briefing on what was unresolved and why it mattered. The documentation from the incident report suggests that no clear communication occurred between Tom and Ruben about the unresolved PFD status. Whether that was a procedural failure on the company's part, a communication breakdown between the two guides, or simply the chaos of a rushed handoff that nobody had prepared a protocol for, the result was the same. Ruben launched with a guest whose PFD compliance was, at best, an open question. I want to be careful here because I'm not in the business of assigning blame to Ruben. He was put in an unfair position. He stepped up when asked, took a group he didn't know, and did his job, but the outcome is what it is. The trip proceeded normally for the first part of the run. Browns Canyon's lower sections ease you in before the water gets serious, and a well-guided group can build confidence and settle into the rhythm of paddling before the bigger features arrive. There's something almost counterintuitive about the early miles of that run. The river looks deceptively manageable. The canyon walls are gorgeous, the water is clear, and if you've never been in real whitewater before, you might look at the first few ripples and think the whole thing was overblown. That relaxation can be dangerous, because the river doesn't stay mellow. Ruben was a certified guide. He knew the river. The other guests on the raft were, by all indications, following instructions and paddling cooperatively. Miriam, though, appears to have been a problem on the water as well, based on the plausibility assessments made during the investigation. Given the pattern established at staging the complaints, the resistance, the escalation, investigators considered it plausible, and I think reasonably so, that she may have continued to be non-compliant on the raft. This is inferred from physical evidence and witness statements from the other guests, not from direct observation. No one was watching her every move throughout the entire trip, but the picture that emerges suggests someone who had not fully bought into the safety framework she was operating inside. The other guests on the raft later described the trip as tense in a way they couldn't fully articulate, which isn't surprising. It's hard to explain why a dynamic feels off when you can't point to one specific thing. Tense is the word that came up more than once. One specific point that came up repeatedly in the investigation was the state of her PFD during the on-water portion of the trip. Without a confirmed resolution to the fitting issue at staging, and given the handoff that occurred, investigators assessed it as plausible that Miriam's PFD was not properly secured for at least some portion of the trip. Again, this is reconstruction based on physical evidence and the circumstances of what was found later, confirmed by a direct witness who saw her on the water at that specific moment. The Class 4 section of this particular run is a stretch that the guides know intimately. The features there are consistent. They're shaped by canyon walls and bedrock, not shifting sandbars, so experienced guides can read the water and position the raft to avoid the worst hydraulics.
A hydraulic, sometimes called a hole, is a recirculating feature at the base of a drop where water curls back upstream and can trap and hold a swimmer. Getting caught in a hydraulic is the kind of thing that kills people even when they're wearing their PFD properly. Without one, the math changes dramatically. The investigation was unable to reconstruct exactly what happened at the rapid. What it could establish was a sequence of facts. The raft entered the rapid section with all guests and the guide aboard, and it exited without Miriam. The raft did not capsize. No other guests went overboard. Ruben was present and functional on the raft when shore staff observed the raft coming through downstream. The most plausible scenario, and the one the investigation treated as the most likely based on physical evidence, was that Miriam went over the side of the raft during the rapid section and was immediately separated from the group. How that happened, whether she was thrown by a wave, stood up at the wrong moment, shifted her weight unexpectedly, failed to brace properly, or some combination of factors, cannot be stated with certainty. What can be said is that she entered the water in a Class 4 environment, and her PFD situation made survival in that environment significantly less likely than it would have been for a guest in proper compliance. A human body in cold, fast, technical water has very few resources available to it. Proper buoyancy is at the top of that list. Without it, the river doesn't give you much to work with. Ruben, for his part, faced an impossible split-second situation, the kind of high-stakes, life-or-death moment that river guides train for but hope never actually comes. Imagine this. You have a raft full of guests, each one trusting you with their safety. You have moving water, churning and unpredictable, with hidden rocks and currents. And you have a person in the river suddenly separated from the craft and at the mercy of the flow. In that instant, Ruben's mind had to process dozens of variables: the speed of the water, the weight of the raft, the location of hazards, and the desperate cries of the swimmer. His immediate responsibility, as any certification course would teach, was to the guests still on the raft, the ones he could still protect, the ones who had not yet been lost to the current. Recovering a swimmer overboard while simultaneously managing a fully loaded raft through technical water is simply not a one-person job. It requires a coordinated team and a calm environment. The standard protocols for that exact situation, protocols developed from decades of accident analysis and expert consensus, involve first getting the raft to calm water, then securing the raft against further drift or flip, and only then initiating swimmer recovery procedures. They do not involve abandoning the raft and jumping in after someone in the middle of a rapid, because doing so would almost certainly leave the remaining guests unguided and at even greater risk. Ruben followed those protocols to the letter. He did what the protocols required, even as every human instinct might have screamed to dive in after the lost person. Whether that was the right call in a human sense, a moral, emotional, gut-level sense, and whether it was the right call in a technical, procedural, risk management sense are two separate conversations, each with its own weight. I won't pretend to have a simple answer here. I'll let you decide on that for yourself. When a raft reaches the takeout point, what outfitters call the termination staging area shore staff are waiting. They're doing a head count, logging arrivals, helping guests out of the water, and managing the end-of-trip process. The company's protocols required that every raft arrive with the same number of guests that launched. This sounds obvious, but it's a hard count every time, because the alternative is the scenario where someone is missing and no one notices until hours later. When Ruben's raft arrived, shore staff flagged the discrepancy immediately. A guest was unaccounted for. Ruben, from everything in the documentation, reported what had happened to the best of his knowledge. The company's emergency protocols activated right away, and I do want to give them credit for that. Shore staff coordinated with river authorities, initiated contact with search and rescue, and began locking down the incident for documentation. The clock that matters in a missing swimmer situation is very short. Cold water, strong current, and the mechanics of drowning don't wait for bureaucratic processes. Devin Miriam's date, the man who had accompanied her to the river that day, was present at the termination staging area, along with the other guests who had been evacuated from the raft trip. He did not vanish, he did not make a scene, and he did not seek attention. Instead, he gave a brief, straightforward statement to the company guides and to the responding authorities who arrived on the scene. That statement was short, factual, and cooperative. Nothing more, nothing less. He did not speak to the media. Not a single reporter, not a single camera, not a single quote attributed to him in any news outlet. That's consistent across everything I found in my own review of the incident. No interviews, no social media posts, no public commentary whatsoever. He was transported separately from the other guests, which may have been by design or by circumstance, I don't know, and I'm not speculating. Once at the staging area, he answered the questions he was asked, gave whatever information he had, and then stepped back. And that was the extent of his visible visible involvement in what came after, the aftermath, the investigation, the media coverage, the quiet return to normal life.
I'm not reading anything into that. I'm not implying he was cold or distant or unusually composed. I'm simply reporting what the record shows.
He had just experienced something genuinely traumatic, a sudden, violent, life-altering event on the water, and he had no obligation to do anything else. No obligation to speak to reporters, no obligation to comfort strangers, no obligation to offer a public statement, no obligation to explain himself or his reaction to anyone. He showed up, he answered, and he withdrew. That is his right. That is more than enough. Search and rescue operations on a river like the Arkansas use a combination of physical searching and predictive modeling. The way moving water works, a submerged or floating object.
How clinical that sounds when we're talking about a person.
Predictable paths based on current speed, channel shape, and the locations of eddies. An eddy is a section of calmer, slower water on the downstream side of an obstruction like a boulder or a bend in the bank. Floating objects and, unfortunately, swimmers tend to collect in eddies. That's where search teams look first, and that's where they deploy the most resources. Teams deploy downstream from the last known position, working the eddy lines in slow water while other personnel walked the shoreline. The Arkansas in this stretch isn't a smooth, flat river even outside the rapid sections. It's technical, boulder-strewn, and the banks are rough enough that a shoreline search requires real effort and real footing. The canyon walls close in at certain points and make aerial observation complicated. It's not an easy environment to search, even when you know roughly what drift path to follow. Miriam was located several hours after the initial alert was broadcast to search and rescue teams. She was found in a slower eddy zone, a calm pocket of water downstream of the main rapid section, which was entirely consistent with the drift modeling that the search teams had used to predict where a swimmer would most likely be carried by the current. The fact that she ended up exactly where the models predicted is, in its own grim and sobering way, a testament to how well the teams knew their environment. Every bend, every boulder, every hydraulic feature that shapes the river's violent choreography. She was recovered by water-based search personnel who had been navigating the same technical channels, and she was transported to a staging area where medical professionals were waiting. Despite their efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death, as confirmed by the subsequent autopsy and incident review, was drowning specifically. Freshwater drowning in the cold, fast-moving flow of the Arkansas River, complicated by the fact that her personal flotation device was not properly secured at the time she entered the water. Her PFD, when examined, was found to be improperly secured. The specifics of that finding, which buckles, in what state are part of the incident documentation, but the headline is clear. It was not on her the way it should have been. Whether that was the state it was in when she entered the water, or whether it shifted or came loose during her time in the river, investigators considered both possibilities. But the weight of the physical evidence pointed toward a PFD that had not been properly fastened before the trip launched. That finding circled back directly to the staging dispute, the handoff, and the unresolved status that Reuben had never been told about. The raft was recovered separately downstream and logged as part of the incident record. The official incident classification noted both a procedural failure in the termination staging process, meaning the handoff from Tom to Reuben, without proper status communication, and PFD noncompliance escalation, meaning the chain of events starting from the staging dispute. After the final report was filed and the outfitter's reputation took a lasting hit, it became painfully clear that Miriam's relentless need to assert control and demand special treatment didn't just cost a guide his job, it cost her the very people who could have helped her when the water turned deadly. Being a Karen doesn't just alienate strangers, it quietly dismantles the safety net of goodwill and patience around you, leaving you isolated at the exact moment you need others most.